April 4th, 1872. 5 worn but ambitious cattlemen stepped into a Cheyenne livery stable and decided that the grass, water, and drifting herds of Wyoming territory would be guarded as if they belonged to them alone. The men smelled of sweat, dust, and trail smoke, and the horses tied just outside snorted in the cold spring wind that pushed grit under the stable door while they talked of thieves, strays, and profit. They were tired of riding after missing stock and tired of hearing rumors that unbranded calves were disappearing into the herds of rough neighbors. They agreed that loose talk and scattered efforts would end, and that from that day forward they would act together, keep records, and make examples of anyone who challenged their control of cattle on the high plains. The group gave their committee a formal name, the Stock Association of Laramie County, and agreed that they would meet regularly in Cheyenne, the growing rail town that tied their far-spread ranges to eastern markets. They wrote down rules for roundups, agreed on how brands would be recorded, and pledged money to hire riders and detectives whose only task was to watch the range and report any hint of rustling. Each man represented a ranch with hundreds or thousands of cattle scattered over country that could barely be ridden in 2 hard days. Together they saw themselves as the only serious guardians of order in a territory that still had more antelope than people, and they spoke with confidence in shaping how the entire region would run. Over the next few years, the committee evolved into a broader organization that reached beyond Cheyenne and Laramie County. Other cattlemen joined, drawn by the chance to have a voice in roundups, shipping schedules, and the unwritten law of the open range. By the mid-1870s, the association was coordinating spring and fall gatherings of herds across wide stretches of southeastern Wyoming. Riders from many outfits rode together, sweeping the prairie in long lines, pushing bawling cattle toward agreed gathering points along creeks and river bottoms. At each camp, a man trusted by the association kept tally, checked brands, and settled disputes by marking them in notebooks rather than pulling a gun. With each passing season, the organization grew more assertive. When the Stock Association of Laramie County changed its name to the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, it no longer pretended to speak only for a handful of men near Cheyenne. Members rode the trains east, sat in hotel parlors in Chicago and New York, and convinced investors that Wyoming grass could turn eastern capital into steady streams of beef and interest payments. British agents crossed the Atlantic with letters of introduction and large drafts, toured the ranges with local guides, and went home ready to raise money for companies that would buy cattle by the trainload and lease or control vast tracts of public domain range. By the late 1870s and early 1880s, outfits backed by foreign or Eastern money-controlled herds that dwarfed the holdings of ordinary family ranchers. The Swan Land and Cattle Company, financed from Scotland, built its headquarters near Chugwater and spread herds across eastern Wyoming and into neighboring territory. The Fruin brothers, sons of English landed gentry, established their big ranch on the Powder River and reorganized it as the Powder River Cattle Company. Together with American-owned spreads, they turned the open country between the North Platte River and the Bighorn foothills into one enormous, loosely supervised pasture where cattle from many brands drifted over the same grass and drank from the same streams. The environment that fed this empire looked generous to outsiders who saw only wide grassland stretching from the base of the Bighorn Mountains to the breaks of the Powder and Clear Creek. In wet years, the short buffalo grass and grama rose thick and green by early summer, and cattle that survived the winter without much attention put on weight quickly. Snow usually blew off the ridges and collected in drifts in the draws, which meant that herds could paw through to dry forage on many open slopes. Big ranches depended on that pattern, counting on the land itself to feed and water their stock, with only scattered line camps and a few hired hands to ride the perimeter. From the start, this system favored those who could put the greatest number of animals on the range. The association schedules dictated when roundups would begin and where they would sweep. Smaller owners had to trail their cattle to the main gathering points if they wanted their brands recognized. In many cases, a man with a few dozen head in a side valley had to depend on association riders to acknowledge his mark on a bawling calf in the dust and confusion of a large herd. When disputes arose over an unbranded yearling or a calf mothered by a cow from one outfit but found running with another, the man with more influence in the association usually heard the decision go his way. Cheyenne became the social and political capital of this open-range system. Members of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association gathered in its restaurants, offices, and private clubs during the winter to drink, talk, and plan the coming season. The most powerful cattlemen built or bought homes in town while their foremen and cowboys wintered in rough board bunkhouses hundreds of miles to the north. Territorial officials, judges, and legislators attended association dinners and came to understand that the men who trailed cattle by the tens of thousands also expected to shape the statutes that defined brands, fencing, and stock law. When the territory moved toward statehood, the same faces that sat in the association meetings appeared in the legislature and the governor's office. Far to the north, in the country that would become Johnson County, the impact of those meetings was felt in more practical ways. Survey lines and county boundaries existed on paper, but on the ground trails, water and grass told the real story. The Powder River ran north through broken hills and open benchland, fed by draws that carried snowmelt from the Bighorn Range. Cottonwood groves marked the best campsites along the creeks, and wherever there was a reliable spring or a sheltered bend in the river, an association ranch either held it or planned to. Foremen posted by the big outfits staked out line camps at key water points and expected smaller cattlemen to keep their distance or accept a subordinate place. Cowboys working for the large companies rode long circuits through that country, sleeping in sod-roofed shacks or small log cabins, moving from one camp to another as they checked on scattered herds. A typical hand might be responsible for watching thousands of animals over miles of rough ground. Pay came in steady but modest wages, and the job was dangerous in quiet ways. A rider could be thrown and pinned far from help or caught in an early snowstorm miles from shelter. Yet for many young men, the work seemed better than sweating in a mine or pushing a plow. They learned to follow the unwritten rules of the range, never question the tally, never challenge the brand on a calf declared for a major outfit, and do not talk out of turn regarding animals that seemed to have strayed too conveniently into a powerful neighbor's herd. In this system, small operators entered late and at a disadvantage. A homesteader who filed a claim along a creek bottom in Johnson County might start with a handful of milk cows, a team, and a few range steers. He and his family broke sod, built a dugout or small house, fenced a patch of ground for hay, and turned their animals loose on what the law still treated as public domain. In theory, the Homestead and Desert Land Acts gave him the same right to use the range as any large company. In practice, when roundup season came, he needed cooperation from riders who worked for men he had never met. If those riders ignored his brand or delayed bringing his cattle to the tally, his small herd could disappear into the larger mass that flowed past the roundup wagons. Conflicts in these early years often began quietly. A settler might arrive at a creek where an association line camp had stood empty through the winter, find no one in sight, and dig a spring or stake a garden plot. When the big outfit moved riders back into the camp in spring, the foreman would ride over, look at the new house, and inform the newcomer that the land had long served as range headquarters and that no one expected a fence or potato patch there. Sometimes the two sides reached an uneasy understanding, with the homesteader promised a small hay meadow in return for allowing cattle to water freely through his claim. In other cases, the message came through cutting remarks, lost calves, and horses turned loose with cinch straps sliced during the night. The association's leader saw these incidents as problems to be managed firmly rather than as disputes between equals. In their view, the large outfits had brought order and investment to a wild region, and now faced threats from drifters, smallholders, and opportunists who did not respect the older customs of the range. When a few unbranded calves vanished from the edge of a big herd, many in Cheyenne assumed that the nearest small rancher had lifted them. When a band of horses disappeared from a winter pasture, the suspicion fell on men with no strong ties to the association. Letters and telegrams passed between ranch offices and the Cheyenne headquarters, naming suspects and asking for action. From that demand for action grew a culture of private enforcement. The association paid detectives and range riders who operated outside normal county structures, tracking suspected thieves and reporting on neighbors who seemed too prosperous for the size of their recorded herds. Newspapers sympathetic to the cattlemen praised these efforts and called for stern measures against rustlers. Stories circulated in bunkhouses and saloons describing men found hanging from cottonwood branches, shot from their saddles on lonely trails, or driven off their claims after night visits from masked riders. Even when details remained uncertain, the lesson was clear to small ranchers and would be repeated later in Johnson County with greater force. Buffalo, which would become the seat of Johnson County, started as a frontier settlement at the foot of the Bighorn Mountains, a place where soldiers, teamsters, and freighters passed through on their way along the Bozeman Trail. As the cattle boom spread northward in the late 1870s, the town also drew cowboys between seasons and freighters hauling supplies to remote ranches. Saloons, general stores, and blacksmith shops lined its few streets. Merchants in Buffalo relied on trade from both big company outfits and independent settlers who hauled in wool, hides, and small lots of cattle. From the beginning, the town stood between these two worlds, tied economically to the large ranches yet physically close to families who wanted more secure landholding than the open range allowed. By the early 1880s, the balance of population in the Powder River country had begun to shift. Each year brought more families with wagons loaded with furniture, seed, and hope. They claimed land along creeks that had once served mainly as watering stops for trail herds and put up rough cabins and frame houses with yards, gardens, and school books on the shelf. They attended church services in borrowed halls, talked of building schools, and organized basic county functions. At the same time, stock trains continued to roll east from Wyoming railheads, loaded with beeves shipped under the brands of the great companies that dominated the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. Those companies saw danger in this change. A homesteader, who gained a patent to 160 acres along a key stretch of creek, could control access to water for thousands of acres of surrounding range. A cluster of claims in a valley could block the traditional drift of cattle seeking shelter in winter and shade in summer. To men who had grown used to treating the open range as a single vast pasture, these small fenced parcels felt like trespasses on an unwritten understanding. In their minds, the land already belonged to the outfits that had risked capital to fill it with cattle, and newcomers were reaping the benefits of years of work without paying their share of the cost. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association responded in several ways. Through its influence in territorial and later state government, it supported laws that favored large herd owners in brand disputes and gave inspectors backed by the association a strong say at shipping points. It pressed for rules that made it easier to prosecute alleged stock theft and harder for small ranchers to defend themselves if accused. Association members who held county and state offices often chose sheriffs, prosecutors, and judges who shared their outlook or at least respected their wishes. On the ground, foremen and riders carried that authority with them in the way they dealt with smaller neighbors. Through the mid-1880s, the system still appeared stable to many of the men who met each spring at association gatherings in Cheyenne. Cattle prices remained high, Foreign investment continued to flow, and the number of animals on the range kept growing. Eastern and British visitors attended brandings and roundups as social events, entertained at ranch houses nicknamed castles, and at the lavish Cheyenne Club where cattle owners poured drinks and told stories that made the range sound manageable and profitable. Yet beneath those confident gatherings, every added head on the grass and every new homestead claim in the Powder River country tightened the strain on land, water, and patience. In the hills and creek bottoms of future Johnson County, cowboys and small ranchers could already feel that strain years before the shooting started. Riders reported thinner grass on some winter ranges and more cattle crowding into sheltered draws during storms. Homesteaders watched strays push through their fences to reach haystacks and stored feed, and they argued with foremen who insisted that the feed rightly belonged to the drifting herds. Each such argument, whether settled with a tense handshake or a muttered threat, added another thread to a growing web of resentment. The men in Cheyenne who believed they owned the range were certain that firm action and organized power would keep their hold on the land. The families in Johnson County who lived face to face with that power were beginning to wonder how long they could endure it without pushing back. In the closing weeks of 1885, the air over northern Wyoming turned sharp and dry, while thin ice formed early along the edges of the Powder River and Clear Creek. Grass on the high ridges above Johnson County had already browned and broken under cattle hooves months before, grazed close by herds that had grown far faster than the land could recover. Ranch cooks stacked dwindling supplies of flour and beans in rough storerooms while cowboys pulled on heavier coats and saddled winter horses that already showed ribs through dusty hair. Men who had ridden those ranges for years noticed the feel of the sky and the brittle grass under their boots when they stepped away from the bunkhouse steps, and they understood that the coming season would test every outfit from the smallest homestead to the largest open-range company. For a long stretch of years before that point, the Powder River country had seemed able to absorb any number of animals. Each spring, trainloads of young steers arrived from Texas and the Southwest, unloaded at railheads farther south and pushed north onto pastures that had once carried only buffalo and a few scattered bands of Indian horses. Cattle companies backed by Eastern and British money had competed with one another to place more stock on the range each year, reasoning that the more animals carried, the more beef shipped and profits realized. That pressure had already shortened grass on many winter ranges, but the pattern of mild winters and decent summer rains had masked the hazard. By 1885, the number of cattle feeding on the open range in and around Johnson County had grown into the hundreds of thousands, far beyond what anyone had counted when the boom began. The summer leading into that hard season gave an early warning that many men ignored. Rains came late, then failed altogether over wide stretches of country east of the Bighorn Mountains. Creeks that usually held steady flow through July shrank into thin threads between exposed rocks. Shallow ponds that cowboys had relied on for water stops turned into mud flats streaked with hoof marks. Grass along south-facing slopes withered early, leaving only short, brittle stems by the time fall roundups ended. Small ranchers in Johnson County looked out from their cabins and saw bare patches appearing in pastures that had once seemed inexhaustible. They cut hay where they could, knowing that they had fewer stacks than they needed, but they lacked the capital and manpower to do more. Large companies that controlled herds scattered across several counties faced the same conditions, but on a wider scale. Foremen sent back reports from line camps describing ponds gone dry and cattle crowding into the last green draws. Already those herds had grazed down the more sheltered valleys that usually carried them through winter. Yet the owners who sat in Cheyenne, Omaha, or Boston had stock certificates and profit tables in front of them rather than bare, ground and dusty cattle. To protect their investments, they pressed their managers to carry as many animals as possible through the cold season, hoping that the pattern of previous years would repeat and that open-range feeding would suffice once again. Few undertook the costly work of buying extra feed or cutting large reserves of hay in Johnson County itself. When the first heavy snowstorm rolled in from the northwest in late autumn, the change on the ground was sudden and brutal. Temperatures dropped fast, driven by steady wind that piled snow in drifts along fences, creek banks, and coulees. Cattle scattered across the hills woke to find the grass that had barely sustained them now hidden beneath a crust of ice and powder that their weakened bodies could barely paw aside. Horses broke through drifts up to their bellies as cowboys tried to keep herds moving toward lower ground. For days at a time, men on Johnson County spreads rode with scarves frozen stiff around their faces, squinting through needles of blowing snow while their mounts slipped and stumbled. Every mile they covered revealed gaunt animals standing motionless with heads lowered, too cold and hungry to move far from the last patches of brush. Through that winter, ranch hands in the Powder River country learned to read death across the landscape. A line of dark shapes half buried along a fence line marked a group of cattle that had drifted until wire stopped them, then bunched together in the wind until they fell. Near creek crossings, carcasses lay scattered where ice had given way beneath hooves, swallowing beasts desperate for water. In draws where snow collected deepest, men saw horn tips and stiff legs protruding from drifts that would not melt until spring. Each ride from camp to camp took longer as horses labored through crusted snow and riders stopped again and again to note dead animals for later count. Plenty of those cattle had carried brands of the largest outfits, but many also bore the marks of small Johnson County ranchers who had built herds from a few head acquired with years of scraping. The men who worked closest to the stock endured long stretches of physical misery as they tried to keep animals alive. At ranches along Clear Creek and its branches, cowboys broke ice on watering holes each morning with axes and iron bars, swinging until their hands split and bled from cold. They dragged weak cattle toward haystacks with teams of horses, only to find that the animals were too far gone to eat. In some camps, riders cut down cottonwoods and willows so that starving beasts could chew bark and browse on fallen twigs. At night, men came back to cramped bunkhouses with faces wind-burned raw, pulling off frozen gloves and boots while they listened to the wind howl against plank walls. The sound of distant lowing had already changed, thinning as more animals fell silent. Small stockmen who had put up modest hay supplies felt those losses like blows to the body. A Johnson County homesteader who had managed to lay in several stacks of grass near his house hauled feed out until both he and his team trembled with exhaustion. When neighbors arrived on borrowed sleds asking to share that hay for their own weakened cattle, he faced choices that cut against every instinct for hospitality on the frontier. If he refused, they might lose their herds and with them their claims to a future on the land. If he agreed, his own animals might starve before spring. Families in log houses along the creeks watched the snow pile higher outside their doors while they listened to their own livestock bawling through the night and wondered which animals would still be standing when the thaw came. By late winter, the figures that began to emerge from trail notebooks and ranch records showed a scale of loss that stunned even the most hardened range managers. Some outfits counted only a fraction of their branded cattle still alive. In certain stretches of the Powder River country, riders could travel for miles along draws where carcasses lay so thick that a man could step from one frozen body to the next without touching bare ground. Johnson County ranchers who had hoped to build herds into the hundreds found themselves with only small remnants, sometimes just a few cows and calves huddled close to the sheltered backside of a barn. For large companies that had once boasted of tens of thousands of head, the winter erased years of apparent growth in a single season. Spring did not bring quick relief. When the snow finally began to recede in 1886, It uncovered rank piles of dead animals scattered over the range. Meltwater ran through fields fouled with carcasses that had swollen and split under the weight of snow and ice. The stench drifted across Johnson County as the ground softened and teams tried to pull wagons along muddy tracks. Men rode out to tally losses, marking down brand after brand as they counted corpses in draws and along river bends. Coyotes and wolves picked at the remains, and flocks of scavenging birds settled in black clouds over the worst patches. Every tally sheet carried numbers that confirmed ruin, and every ruined balance sheet hardened tempers in bunkhouses and boardrooms alike. Financial consequences hit owners with a force equal to the weather. Investors in distant cities opened letters from Wyoming that contained stark inventories of missing cattle and grim notes from managers describing months of hardship. Companies that had expanded aggressively with borrowed funds suddenly faced unpaid interest and principal with no immediate prospect of recovery. In the same period, beef prices sagged as railheads shipped far fewer animals than expected, and markets reacted to damaged carcasses and thin stock. Some foreign-backed outfits failed outright, their backers writing off entire operations. Others staggered on by cutting wages, dismissing riders, and consolidating scattered camps into fewer headquarters. In Johnson County, the reaction among the largest surviving outfits and their allies in the Wyoming Stock Growers Association followed a clear path. Instead of admitting that overstocking and neglect of winter forage had helped create the catastrophe, many of these leaders focused on another target. They argued that the losses proved that thieves had been at work for years, bleeding herds in good season so badly that when the hard winter struck, the margin of survival disappeared. In their view, small ranchers, independent cowboys, and settlers running a few unregistered cattle had long taken advantage of open range conditions to lift unbranded calves and alter marks on young animals. Now that nature had struck a severe blow, they insisted that half measures against such men would no longer suffice. Talk that had once centered on rail shipping schedules and breeding plans shifted toward security and reprisal. Association meetings in Cheyenne and private conversations in the drawing rooms of powerful men turned to the problem of enforcing brand law across the northern ranges. Representatives of large Johnson County outfits carried stories to those gatherings of calves found with fresh brands near homestead cabins, of yearlings that had drifted to small holdings and never reappeared in big herd counts, and of cowboys who had left company employ and shortly thereafter turned up with herds of their own that seemed too large for their means. Whether each story rested on proof or rumor mattered less than the overall impression they created in minds already sharpened by financial loss and wounded pride. On the ground near Buffalo and across Johnson County, small ranchers felt the change in attitude as a tightening noose. Men who had once worked side by side with company cowboys during roundups began hearing that they no longer had a place in those gatherings unless they joined the association on terms they considered unfair. New regulations appeared that restricted participation in spring and fall roundups to members approved by the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. Brand inspectors at shipping points grew more aggressive, questioning marks on animals driven in by independent producers and sometimes refusing to certify cattle for shipment without lengthy delays. Each such delay cost the small rancher money in feed, time, and lost market opportunities. Families who had struggled through the hard winter with minimal outside help now found themselves branded with suspicion by the very men whose cattle had trampled their fences and eaten their hay. A Johnson County homesteader who had managed to save a portion of his herd by feeding hay, cut from his own claim, now heard whispers that his cattle counted too many animals of a certain age or color, implying that they had not all been born on his ground. When he rode into Buffalo to buy supplies, he felt the weight of eyes on his back as he moved through the general store. Local merchants, caught between dependence on large companies and sympathy for their small customers, tried to walk a narrow line, extending credit where they could while avoiding open confrontation with association leaders. Cowboys, too, found themselves forced into choices that cut across prior friendships. A working hand in Johnson County might have spent one season riding for a large outfit and the next trailing cattle for a smaller ranch where conditions felt more personal. After the Great Die-Up, the bigger companies began to expect a level of loyalty that resembled military discipline rather than seasonal hire. Foremen asked pointed questions about where men spent their off time and with whom they associated. Riders known to be friendly with independent ranchers or who expressed doubts about company policies sometimes found their contracts quietly dropped at the end of a season. Others accepted steady pay and sided with the association, bringing back reports on neighbors and former bosses who had moved outside the orbit of the dominant outfits. Within the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, a hard core of leaders concluded that strict law, court action, and private policing would have to combine if they were to recover from the disaster and protect their remaining herds. They pressed for tighter statutes regarding brands, fencing, and trespass, and they backed county officials who promised to prosecute alleged rustlers vigorously. At the same time, they hired professional detectives and gunmen to watch the ranges of northern Wyoming, gather lists of men suspected of theft, and prepare cases that would stretch beyond any single incident. Johnson County, with its growing population of determined small ranchers and its mixture of loyalty and resentment toward the large companies, stood squarely in their sights. For those small operators and settlers, the years immediately following the Great Die-Up hardened more than just attitudes. They rebuilt their herds slowly, starting with survivors of the winter and a few purchased animals. Many added sheep or other stock to spread risk, and they relied heavily on family labor to cut hay, mend fences, and improve houses. Children grew used to long days in fields and pastures, and women turned homesteads into centers of production that mixed garden plots, poultry, and dairy work with the constant demands of frontier life. Every improvement hammered into place testified to their belief that they had a permanent claim on the land, secured through hardship and endurance rather than distant investment. By the close of 1888, the physical scars of the Great Die-Up began to fade from the surface of the Johnson County prairie, but its deeper effects remained embedded in the memories and calculations of all involved. The largest surviving outfits and their association allies now saw northern Wyoming as a region where discipline had to be imposed to prevent further erosion of their power and capital. Small ranchers and homesteaders, having survived one of the worst winters in memory largely on their own, believed more strongly than ever that the land belonged to those who worked it year-round. Between those two positions lay a widening gulf of distrust. The harsh season of starving cattle and frozen cowboys had not yet produced gunfire in Johnson County, but it had created the conditions under which a future conflict would no longer be contained by talk, rules, or minor legal cases. On a hot afternoon in July of 1889, riders along a gulch near the Sweetwater River reined in at a sight that froze them in their saddles. A man and a woman hung from the limb of a pine tree, bodies swaying slightly in the dry wind that carried dust across the rocks. The woman's skirt had twisted around her legs and the man's boots pointed stiffly toward the ground. Neither had been given a scaffold or a priest, only a rope and a shallow cut in the bark where the nooses had dragged. Word spread quickly that the dead were James Averill and Ella Watson, small ranchers whose land and cattle had brought them into direct conflict with some of the strongest cattle interests in central Wyoming. For years before that afternoon, Ella Watson had tried to build a modest life along the Sweetwater. Born Ellen Liddy Watson in Canada and raised in a working family, she had come west, married and separated, and then found her way into Wyoming territory, where land laws opened a narrow opportunity for people without large capital. Near Independence Rock, she took up a homestead claim that included access to water flowing through otherwise open public range. She worked as a cook and seamstress and gradually began to assemble a small herd, buying cattle and filing for a brand. Her homestead sat beside land controlled by rancher Albert John Bothwell, who already ran substantial numbers of cattle in the area. James Averill, who shared her life and work though their legal marital status remained complex, held a separate claim nearby and ran a combination of small ranch, stage station, and store. He had served as a soldier and a freighter and now tried to anchor himself in one place. Averill secured an appointment as postmaster and justice of the peace for the small community that formed along that stretch of trail. He wrote letters to Wyoming newspapers criticizing the conduct of large cattle operators who fenced public land and treated small settlers as intruders. Those letters, signed under his own name, reached readers far beyond the Sweetwater and marked him in the eyes of men who resented any public challenge to their control of the range. Tension between the couple and their powerful neighbor sharpened when Ella's use of land and water threatened Bothwell's hold on a key stretch of the river. By fencing part of her claim and filing to build an irrigation ditch to bring more water across it, she asserted rights that federal and territorial law granted homesteaders. Each fence post that went into the ground limited the free drift of Bothwell's cattle down to the river. Each new ditch stake marked a potential reduction in the water that would pass his own head gates. At the same time, the larger cattle interests in Wyoming, already alarmed by the losses of the hard winter of 1886 and 1887, were in no mood to treat small operators charitably. To them, every maverick calf or disputed brand represented property they insisted belonged to the big outfits. In the months before the lynching, pressure mounted around Watson's attempts to build her herd. She had applied more than once for a recorded brand and met resistance. She bought thin animals cheaply, rehabilitated them on her land, and then prepared to put her mark on their calves. When she finally branded dozens of cattle during the 1889 season, some neighboring ranchers claimed that animals bearing her new mark included stock that did not rightfully belong to her. A range detective in the pay of cattle interests accused her of rustling. The accusation fit neatly into a pattern that leaders of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association had been repeating for years, portraying small ranchers and independent settlers as thieves who lived off calves taken from the margins of great herds. On July 20th, a group of 6 cattlemen led by Albert Bothwell rode to the homestead and confronted Ella at gunpoint. They told her that she was under arrest for cattle theft and ordered her onto a buckboard. She had no chance to summon a lawyer or appear before a judge. The men took her away from her home toward a gulch where they had already chosen a tree. Along the way, they seized James Averill as well, claiming that he shared responsibility for the alleged thefts. Neighbors later recalled seeing the armed party on the move, the prisoners under guard, dust rising from the wheels and hooves as the group left the traveled road and headed toward the rough ground near the river. At the hanging site, the lynchers worked quickly and without ceremony. They threw ropes over a pine limb, tied nooses, and forced the couple into position beneath the branch. There was no jury box, only rocks and scrub. There was no formal reading of charges, only the accusations shouted by men who controlled herds, money, and local influence. When the ropes tightened and the wagon moved, the law of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association replaced territorial statute in that lonely gulch. The bodies were left hanging as proof that men who owned many cattle would not hesitate to use killing as a tool of range policy. The discovery of the corpses sent a wave of shock through nearby settlements. Ranch hands, freighters, and families came to look, their faces set and guarded as they took in the fact that a woman had been lynched along with a man. In the history of Wyoming Territory and the young state, this was an extremely rare occurrence, and it struck many as a line that should never have been crossed. Sheriff Frank Hadsell of Carbon County moved to assert formal authority. He impaneled a coroner's jury, gathered testimony, and ordered the arrest of 6 ranchers who had taken part in the hanging, including Bothwell. For a moment it appeared that the institutions of territorial justice would weigh the actions of powerful cattlemen as they had weighed the acts of any other citizens. Newspapers aligned with the large outfits rushed to shape public perception in the days after the lynching. Reports in cattleman-friendly papers described Ella Watson under the nickname Cattle Kate, portraying her as a prostitute who traded sex for stolen cattle and as the leader of a rustling ring that preyed on honest ranchers. They cast Averill as her partner in crime, a smooth talker who used his position as a local official to shield theft. Many readers along the range knew the couple personally and doubted these claims, but printing presses in Cheyenne and other towns spread the cattleman's version widely. At the same time, some eastern newspapers and reform-minded observers began to question whether the lynching represented justice or an abuse of power by wealthy stock owners. As the legal process inched forward, the balance of power around the case became clear. Key witnesses who had seen the seizure and hanging of Watson and Averill faced threats and danger. A young cowboy who had observed the abduction and initial hanging preparations disappeared before he could testify. Relatives and friends of the dead couple who might have spoken against the lynchers either left the area under pressure or died under suspicious circumstances. By the time court convened, the prosecution's case had been weakened beyond repair. Charges against the accused ranchers were dismissed, and none of the lynchers served prison time for the double killing. The message reached every homestead and bunkhouse in the region. When powerful cattlemen took direct action, the courts could not or would not force them to answer for it. The lynching also reshaped daily conversations in cabins, line camps, and townside saloons far beyond the Sweetwater. In Buffalo and other Johnson County communities, small ranchers and cowboys gathered around stoves and bar counters to argue about what the Watson and Averill case revealed. Some men who had worked for large outfits claimed that the pair must have done something serious to provoke such a response. Others, especially those who had seen both sides of the range economy, concluded that the couple's real offense lay in claiming water and land that big operators wanted, and in speaking too openly against those operators in print. Families who had sent daughters to visit Ella's homestead with laundry and sewing now thought about the sight of a woman's body hanging from a tree and wondered how far cattle barons would go when they felt challenged. In the months that followed, more violence underscored the pattern that the Sweetwater lynching had set. The range detective who had first lodged accusations against Watson was shot and killed near the same region in circumstances that reflected the growing bitterness around the case. Other men linked to conflicts between large outfits and small operators died by bullet or rope without full judicial accounting. Each such killing widened the sense among ordinary settlers that disputes in Wyoming's cattle country now bypassed normal law. In newspapers and private letters, defenders of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association insisted that only firm action could stop organized rustling. Critics replied that the association was using the label of rustler as a weapon against any competitor, and that the line between law enforcement and private vengeance had been erased. For Johnson County, the Watson and Averill episode acted as an early milestone in a sequence of events that led toward open war. The lynching took place miles away, but the logic behind it matched what smaller operators in the Powder River country were beginning to experience. They had seen brand laws and roundup rules written to favor large herds, and they now saw that when those measures failed to eliminate competition, some cattle barons resorted to ropes and guns. Men in Buffalo who subscribed to regional papers read about the Sweetwater hangings and recognized a pattern that could easily extend to them if they displeased the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. Merchants in Johnson County who depended on both big outfits and small ranchers for their livelihood measured their words more carefully after the Sweetwater news. A storekeeper who extended credit to a homesteader suspected by association agents risked losing business from the large companies. At the same time, refusing such credit drove struggling families closer to ruin. Saloon keepers heard cowboys curse the lynchers one night and defend them the next, each argument shaped by the speaker's current employer. In church meetings and school gatherings, women who had read accounts of Ella's death quietly warned one another to be cautious when dealing with the most powerful ranchers and their foremen. Within the leadership circles of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, the double hanging did not bring a retreat from harsh measures. Instead, it appeared as an example of what determined men could accomplish outside slow courts and lenient juries. Officers of the association continued to fund detectives, compile lists of suspected thieves, and press for tighter control over who could take part in roundups and ship cattle east. The notion that certain settlers and cowboys constituted a criminal class took deeper root in their thinking. When plans later formed to send an armed force into Johnson County, many of the men involved carried in their minds the memory of the Sweetwater Gulch and the belief that decisive violence could reshape the balance of power on the range. By the end of 1890, the Watson and Averill lynching had ceased to be just a local tragedy. It had become a reference point in arguments up and down Wyoming, cited by one side as proof that rustling demanded swift punishment, and by the other as proof that cattle barons had placed themselves above the law. For families in Johnson County who were building homes, cutting hay, and trying to expand modest herds, the case stood as a clear warning. Possessing land with good water, speaking critically of powerful neighbors, or branding cattle in a way that angered the Wyoming Stock Growers Association could bring far more than a lawsuit or a shouted quarrel. It could bring masked riders, ropes over branches, and a coroner's jury reading names over bodies already in the ground. November 1st, 1891. Nate Champion and Ross Gilbertson woke in the gray cold of dawn in a cramped line shack on the Powder River and realized that the door was opening to armed men instead of daylight. The cabin on W.H. Hall's place was a simple one-room box of hewn logs. A narrow bunk against the wall, a rough table, a stove, and a single door that swung inward. Champion slept with his revolver under his pillow, and as the first stranger stepped through the doorway with a pistol leveled at his chest, Champion's hand was already closing on the grip. 4 masked gunmen crowded into the doorway with revolvers and Winchester rifles, their breath smoking in the cold air, hats pulled low and bandanas tied across their faces. One of them barked that they had him at last and ordered him to throw up his hands. The muzzle of a revolver flared a split second later, the shot so close that burned powder scored Champion's cheek and filled the room with the sour reek of black powder. Champion fired back from the bunk in the same instant, his bullet tearing into the first man through the doorway and sending him staggering into his companions. The narrow little room turned into a blind exchange of muzzle flashes and deafening reports. Bullets chewed splinters from the doorframe, punched through the thin mattress, and smashed into the wall inches above Gilbertson's head as he lay frozen beside Champion on the bunk. One slug plowed into the bedding near Champion's ribs, another slammed into one attacker's side, and a third clipped the arm of a gunman trying to fight his way back out through the jammed doorway. The killers had expected a terrified prisoner. Instead, they found a small cowman who shot with a steady hand and did not hesitate. In seconds, the men in the doorway broke and backed out into the half-light, one of them bleeding badly enough to leave a trail through the dust and frost outside. They dropped a Winchester rifle in the scramble and left 4 heavy overcoats hanging on pegs inside the door, abandoned in their rush to escape the room where the target had turned the ambush around. Champion pushed to the door and sent more rounds after their retreating shapes until they vanished in the willows along the riverbank, leaving only trampled footprints, a bloody drag mark, and stray cartridges in the dirt. When the gunfire stopped, Champion and Gilbertson stood in the ruined quiet of the cabin and looked around at the evidence left behind. Powder burns blackened the pillow where his head had just been. The mattress was punched through with holes where bullets had ripped through ticking and straw. The door frame was splintered and the plank floor was scattered with cartridge cases and bits of lead. On the pegs hung the abandoned overcoats, good quality wool garments that did not belong to small homesteaders, and on the floor lay the dropped Winchester with its polished stock and new blued barrel. Champion saddled his horse, with shaking hands, and rode for help, leaving Gilbertson to guard the shack. He carried his story first to neighbors on the Powder River and then to Buffalo, putting names to at least one of the masked assassins. Around pot-bellied stoves in saloons and general stores, he told how he had recognized the build and voice of former Johnson County Sheriff and Stock Association Detective Frank Canton among the men in the doorway. The news did not surprise small ranchers who had watched association detectives ride their fences for years. Now those suspicions had a fresh set of shell casings, a burned face, and an abandoned rifle to go with them. Sheriff William Red Angus took Champion's report seriously. Angus had worked cattle and served in the Army before residents of Johnson County elected him sheriff instead of returning Canton to that office, and he knew the difference between a drunken quarrel and an organized killing attempt. He rode to the hall cabin, walked through the bullet-scarred room, and gathered the evidence into his own hands. The coats, the rifle, the tracks outside, and Champion's detailed account were bundled into an attempted murder case aimed higher than the hired gunman who had pulled the triggers. In the following weeks, Johnson County newspapers described the attack in dry, angry columns that itemized every piece of evidence left behind in the line shack. The Buffalo Bulletin printed Champion's version of the fight, including his account of how the muzzle flash burned his face and how he had driven the would-be killers off with his revolver while Gilbertson lay paralyzed with shock on the bunk. The article named stock detectives Joe Elliott and Frank Canton as men Champion believed had been present. Small ranchers read those lines in Buffalo, KC, and scattered post offices along the Powder and Crazy Woman country, and understood that someone had finally stood up to the people who had been hanging and shooting their neighbors. The attack on Champion and Gilbertson fit into a pattern that had been tightening all year. Earlier that summer, the same circle of association men and stock detectives had lynched Tom Wagoner, a horse trader near Newcastle who had crossed the big outfits once too often. His body was found hanging from a cottonwood tree weeks after his death, feet dragging the ground where the rope had stretched, the remains left weathering in a ravine until a rider stumbled on the scene. That killing sent a message along every trail where small outfits grazed their herds. But the attempt on Champion inside a cabin pushed the menace of assassination directly into Johnson County. Private and public investigations into the Powder River attack followed through the autumn of 1891. One member of the assassination squad pressed in questioning identified his companions to two Powder River ranchers, John A. Tisdale and Orley Ranger Jones. Both men were respected small stockmen who branded their own modest herds on Red Fork of Powder River and nearby range, and they now held information that could tie hired killers to wealthy association backers in Cheyenne. Sheriff Angus and County Attorney William L. Bennett began preparing attempted murder charges against Joe Elliott, while pushing for evidence that might reach into the association offices themselves. The cattle barons read the same newspaper accounts and heard from the same detectives, and they understood the danger in leaving witnesses alive. On November 28, 1891, Orley Ranger Jones rode out of Buffalo toward his homestead south of town. He was 23 years old, a bronc rider and cowboy who had been building a cabin on Red Fork and planning a family future there. As he crossed a bridge roughly 15 miles south of Buffalo, gunmen waiting under the structure opened fire from ambush. Jones fell from the saddle with bullets in his back, his horse running on without him. Passers-by found his body lying near the bridge and carried word back to town that another small rancher had been murdered on the road home. 3 days later, on December 1st, 1891, John Tisdale finished 2 days of business in Buffalo and started home with a wagon piled high with groceries and Christmas toys for his children. He drove south toward his place on Red Fork in cold morning light, the team's breath steaming as the horses pulled the loaded wagon over the frozen road. 8 miles from town, somewhere in a shallow gulch cut across the road, a hidden rifleman put a bullet into Tisdale's back. The same ambush killed his dog and shot down his 2 horses, leaving wagons, supplies, and toys scattered around his body. When neighbors reached the scene, they found a family man dead among the presents he had been taking home for the holiday. News of Tisdale's murder reached Buffalo by afternoon and turned talk in every store, office, and saloon from rumor to rage. In printed editorials and shouted conversations on the boardwalks, residents described the killing as the start of a war of extermination against Johnson County settlers. Fingers pointed immediately toward the same stock detectives whose names had already surfaced in connection with the Powder River attack. Many residents spoke openly of Canton as the man behind the killings, though he surrendered himself and produced witnesses who claimed he had been in town that morning. No one in authority could prove in court who had been waiting in the gulch 8 miles south of town. But few on the street doubted whose interests the killers served. The twin murders of Jones and Tisdale hardened attitudes in Johnson County more completely than any earlier lynching. Both men were known as competent ranchers who had been willing to talk to investigators about the names that linked assassination squads to Cheyenne offices. Their deaths removed crucial witnesses and signaled to every homesteader that the next man shot from ambush might be anybody who dared to testify or organize against the Barons. At the same time, the killings pushed Sheriff Angus, County Attorney Bennett, and a solid majority of local voters into an even more determined effort to use the courts against the men who had hired the guns. In February 1892, Johnson County officials brought Joe Elliott before a justice of the peace in Buffalo for a preliminary hearing on the attempted murder of Champion. The hearing on February 8th drew spectators who had ridden in from ranches up and down the Powder River country. Champion took the stand and repeated in formal testimony what he had already told the sheriff and the newspapers, identifying Elliott as one of the masked men who had stormed the Hall cabin. Lawyers for Elliott worked to undermine Champion's account and to chip away at the chain of evidence built from coats, a rifle, and scattered shell casings. But for the first time, one of the association's own detectives faced a courtroom over the campaign of private violence in Johnson County. The legal pressure in Buffalo landed on men who were not used to answering to county officials. In Cheyenne, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association had built its influence for years through control of territorial legislation, brand inspection rules, and roundups run on its own terms. By 1891, the association's directors were accustomed to calling governors, territorial judges, and federal officials as allies. Now they watched a rural sheriff and a county lawyer in Buffalo push an attempted murder case that might lead a stock detective under oath to name the wealthy men who had sent him north. Within association circles, the talk shifted from scattered hangings and bushwhack killings to a larger operation that would break the resistance of Johnson County in a single open campaign. On the ground in Johnson County, the reaction to Wagoner's hanging, the Powder River attack, and the murders of Jones and Tisdale did not take the form of vigilante rides. Small ranchers and farmers organized themselves into a rival institution. In the wake of the summer and autumn killings, Nate Champion and other small stockmen helped form the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association in Buffalo. The new association opened its doors to anyone who owned cattle or farmed in northern Wyoming, men who had been barred from the older association's membership lists or blacklisted from its roundups. Champion served as a leading officer and spokesman, arguing that small outfits who grazed their herds on public land had the same legal rights as any company cattle concern. The Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association worked through meetings and plans rather than gunfire. Its members met in Buffalo to talk about shipping, brand inspection, and defense of their property. They agreed to hold their own independent spring roundup in 1892, organizing crews and wagons to gather cattle bearing their brands and to claim unmarked maverick calves under the law, instead of handing every stray over to the big outfits. The plan challenged the cattle barons economically as well as politically, because whoever controlled the roundup controlled how many animals went to market and who collected the proceeds from mavericks. Leaders of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association responded with blacklists and orders. Small ranchers who joined the new association found their brands excluded from official roundup lists and faced threats that their cattle would be barred from sale at Cheyenne stockyards. In letters and quiet conversations in banking offices, large cattlemen warned merchants and railroad agents not to deal with men who stood with Champion and Sheriff Angus. They meant to isolate Johnson County rebels economically, just as they had tried to intimidate them with gunmen on lonely roads. Settlers, merchants, and working cowhands in Johnson County answered those pressures with their own economic weapons. Supporters of the new association talked in the Buffalo Bulletin and in private correspondence about withholding business from merchants who openly sided with the Cheyenne barons. Ranchers shifted their shipping plans, looking to send cattle through markets that did not insist on Wyoming Stock Growers Association inspection. And they pooled resources so that small outfits could send joint trainloads instead of relying on buyers tied to the big companies. The boycott efforts reached individual businessmen who backed the barons openly, and some of those men wrote anxious letters to friends and political allies describing nights spent sleeping in their stores with rifles close at hand. Through the winter of 1891 into early 1892, the language used for the conflict hardened on both sides. Cheyenne newspapers loyal to the stock growers printed columns that branded Northern settlers and Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association members as organized rustlers, parasites, and enemies of property. Papers in Johnson County printed editorials describing the cattle barons as murderers hiding behind hired detectives and political influence. Each new article sharpened the division between town and city, small outfit and corporation, until readers across Wyoming understood that the dispute over cattle, grass, and law in Johnson County had become a test of whether local settlers had any real protection under state law. Inside Wyoming Stock Growers Association meeting rooms in Cheyenne, men who had invested fortunes in tens of thousands of head of cattle now spoke openly of invading Johnson County with a private army. Assassination squads and scattered lynchings had removed individual enemies but had not broken the political and legal resistance of the settlers. The attempted murder case against Joe Elliott moved forward in Buffalo, and fresh graves for Jones and Tisdale stood as reminders that the barons were willing to kill respected citizens and still face no jury. By the end of winter, association leaders concluded that they could not allow Johnson County's courts, newspapers, and rival Stock Growers Association to continue challenging their authority. As snow lingered along creek bottoms and drifts held fast in the shade of Powder River breaks, stock trains rolled into Cheyenne hauling Texas cowboys who had been promised good pay for a spring job in Wyoming. Quietly, the association's organizers assembled wagons, ammunition, and supplies for a campaign north. At the same time, in Buffalo and on scattered homesteads, men met under lamplight to talk about the murders, the boycotts, and the coming independent roundup. Both sides understood that some decisive collision lay close ahead, and every rider on the Johnson County range felt that a confrontation was coming soon. April 5, 1892. A three-car Union Pacific Special eased out of the Cheyenne yards before sunrise with 52 armed men packed into its coaches and baggage car, their rifles stacked between seats and ammunition boxes lashed to the floor. Frost still clung to the rails and the wind slid along the Platte Valley. But inside the cars, the air was thick with tobacco smoke, wool, leather, and the oiled metal smell of Winchester repeaters. Some of the men had slept in their clothes on benches, hats pulled over their eyes. Others sat straight, boots planted, hands resting near revolver butts while they watched the gray light seep past the dirty windows and listened to the steady clank of wheels carrying them toward Johnson County. At the head of the party sat Major Frank Wolcott, a Civil War veteran and cattleman who held both military experience and the confidence of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. Near him rode Frank Canton, once Johnson County Sheriff and now one of the association's most feared detectives, carrying a folded paper in his inside pocket that listed the names of men marked for death or capture. Scattered around them were association members, foremen, range detectives, and hired gunmen. 23 of those gunmen had come up from Texas under the leadership of Tom Smith, men used to long rides, dry country, and hard fights. They wore new slickers over trail-worn clothes and cradled rifles that had been inspected and cleaned the night before. The Texans had been recruited in saloons and ranch houses far south of Cheyenne with the promise of good pay, and the story that they would help clean out a nest of organized cattle thieves in Wyoming. Smith described a country where juries would not convict and where rustlers shot down honest stockmen. He offered wages that beat ordinary trail work, plus a bonus at the end of the job. For some, that offer meant a chance to send money home to families. For others, it meant steady work that did not ask too many questions. By the time they stepped onto the platform in Cheyenne, they had already signed on to ride wherever Wolcott and Canton led them. The decision to gather such a force had taken shape through the first weeks of the new year in Cheyenne parlors, association offices, and the private rooms of the Cheyenne Club. Leaders of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association met behind closed doors with maps of Johnson County spread over tables and reports from stock inspectors stacked beside glasses. They reviewed accounts of the hard winter that had gutted herds, of acquittals in cattle theft cases, of assassination attempts that had not silenced resistance in Buffalo, and of the new Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association that planned its own independent roundup. Every report from Johnson County, in their view, pointed to a county that had slipped out of their control. Out of those meetings came a decision to strike not through scattered hangings and road ambushes, but with a single concentrated expedition. Association members drew up a subscription list and pledged money in amounts that dwarfed the daily earnings of any cowboy. The funds were intended to cover train hire, horses, food, ammunition, wages for the Texans, and legal defense for anyone who might later face charges. Some estimates in later years placed the total cost of the operation near $100,000, a sum that only large outfits and their backers could raise. Writing their names beside the pledges, the cattle barons signaled that they were ready to spend heavily to break Johnson County's resistance. As money and men came together, the association's planners compiled the paper that Canton now carried in his pocket. It was a list of 70 names drawn from detective reports, newspaper clippings, court records, and private complaints. On it were small ranchers who had helped form the rival Stock Growers Association, town officials in Buffalo, cowboys who had testified in hearings against stock detectives, and men who had written letters attacking the association in public print. Each entry carried not just a name, but often a brief note describing where the man lived, what brand he ran, and how he had angered Cheyenne interests. The purpose of the expedition was written plainly in that list. The men on it were to be run down, shot, or hanged until Johnson County bent or broke. The list itself folded and refolded until the edges went soft, passed only between a small circle of leaders. Canton kept it most of the time, checking names as the planners argued over routes and priorities. Wolcott and other association officers studied it with him in quiet corners, deciding who would be hit first and how much time they could spare before Buffalo heard the news and raised a defense. They understood that a fast strike at a few key targets might scatter opposition, while a slow, methodical hunt risked stirring the entire county into arms. On the train that morning, Canton opened the paper again and traced his finger down the column of names as the car rocked beneath him, memorizing the ones they expected to find near the Powder River and along Crazy Woman Creek. Along with men and money, the planners gathered weapons and supplies on a scale that left no doubt about the nature of their mission. Association members purchased or collected the latest Winchester repeating rifles, Colt revolvers, and thousands of cartridges. Boxes of ammunition were marked and stacked in the baggage car beside crates of dynamite, coils of fuse, and kegs of black powder. Grain and provisions for both men and horses were loaded as if for a military campaign. Saddles, bridles, and packs were labeled for quick sorting once the train reached its last stop. The invaders, as they would soon be called, did not intend to rely on local resources or goodwill in the county they were about to enter. They planned to carry their war with them. Political cover for the expedition developed in parallel with the physical preparations. Many of the same men who sat on the executive committee of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association also held or influenced state offices. Governor Amos Barber's sympathies lay with the large cattle interests, and leading Republicans in the young state had long relied on the barons for support. As plans for the expedition matured, association leaders spoke in private of the need for quick access to state and federal power if events in Johnson County drew public anger. They expected friendly treatment in Cheyenne's newspapers, which sat under cattle industry control, and they counted on being able to present any killings as the necessary work of a posse confronting an armed criminal element. Still, they understood that marching openly into Johnson County with a large force carried risk. To soften the appearance of what they meant to do, they arranged for certain members of the party to carry documents that they could present as legal authority. Some carried blank warrants or general affidavits accusing unnamed rustlers of crimes. Others held letters of introduction to local officials who might be inclined to side with them. None of this paper changed the fact that the core of their plan rested on the death list in Canton's pocket and on the willingness of 52 mounted men to use their rifles without waiting for a judge. As the train rolled north from Cheyenne, the men inside the coaches shifted between nervous talk and hard silence. Texans clustered near Tom Smith. They rolled cigarettes, checked the actions of their Winchesters, and asked quiet questions about snow depth, water, and how far it would be from the rail line to the first ranches on their route. Some had heard of the hard winter and of the hangings and shootings that had already stained Wyoming's range, but for many the names on Canton's list meant little. They cared more about pay, survival, and avoiding a rope themselves if the law turned against them. Association officers and range detectives sat apart, studying maps and talking in low voices about creeks, fords, and the order in which they hoped to strike. While the train pushed on, Johnson County went about its ordinary early spring work. Snow still lay in drifts along creek banks, and high ground showed brown grass where the wind had swept it clear. Small ranchers checked calving pastures, repaired fences damaged by winter storms, and readied their outfits for the independent roundup planned by the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association. In Buffalo, Sheriff Red Angus and County Attorney Bennett moved through their regular routines, gathering information about brand disputes and minor crimes, unaware that their names sat among the 70 written on a folded sheet of paper riding north in Canton's coat. Families in ranch houses near the Powder and Crazy Woman Creek thought more about thawing ground and spring work than about the possibility of a private army heading their way. By the time the special reached the upper Platte country, the men in the coaches had settled into a rough order. Wolcott and Canton conferred over which ranch they would use as a first staging point once they left the rails. Association members friendly to the expedition had already arranged for supplies and fresh horses to be waiting near Casper. Telegraph lines along the route carried only routine messages while the train sped past small stations in the cold light. No public announcement had been made. Aside from a handful of railroad men and a few officials in Cheyenne, almost no one in Wyoming knew that a force large enough to challenge a county government was already moving across the state. Near Casper, under cover of darkness and secrecy, the train slowed and stopped short of the main depot. Doors slid open and the chill night air poured into the cars along with the smell of pine ties and coal smoke. Men began to lead horses down ramps to the cinder-covered ground, talking in short, clipped phrases as they checked cinches and adjusted saddles. Wagons that had been loaded in Cheyenne were rolled down as well, their wheels jolting over rail joints before hitting dirt. Boxes of ammunition, sacks of grain, and crates of dynamite were transferred from the train to the wagons and pack animals. The clink of metal on metal and the thud of hoof on earth carried through the dark, but there were few witnesses. As soon as the last of the horses and gear were off, riders cut telegraph wires near the siding, snapping the thin strands that linked Casper south to Cheyenne and east to outside newspapers. Without those lines, news of a large armed party leaving the rails could not move ahead of them at wire speed. The men who performed that work did it quickly and without ceremony, using pliers and knives in practiced motions. When the wires sagged, the first layer of secrecy around the expedition hardened into a practical barrier. From that point north, any warning to Johnson County would have to travel by horse. The invaders mounted up and formed column on the cold ground, breath from horses and men mixing in pale clouds that drifted in the night air. Wolcott took the lead position, Canton close by, with Texas gunmen and association riders stretched out behind. Wagons loaded with ammunition and supplies rumbled into place in the center of the column, flanked by mounted men who could turn quickly to meet any threat. With a brief word passed down the line, they started north along the road toward the TTT Ranch and beyond it the Powder River country where many of the names on their list lived and worked. Hoofbeats and wagon wheels marked their slow advance into the dark, a force of 52 riders carrying 70 written names and the backing of the most powerful cattle interests in Wyoming toward a county that still believed ordinary law would govern the coming spring. Before daylight on April 9, 1892, the invaders rode out of the breaks above the middle fork of Powder River and brought their horses to a halt within sight of a low log cabin known as the KC Line Camp. Frost lay in a thin skin over the ground, and the last patches of snow along the draws shone faintly in the starlight. The cabin sat near a clump of willows and cottonwoods, a rough one-room shelter with a small corral, a shed, and a few haystacks close by. Inside, 4 men slept, unaware that 52 armed riders were spreading across the hills to ring their camp in a tightening circle of rifles. The KC cabin served as an outpost for a small outfit and as a base for men watching their own scattered cattle. Nate Champion had spent the previous night there with fellow cowman Nick Ray and 2 itinerant workers who had hired on for odd jobs. Champion's own small herd grazed in the surrounding country, and he had come to the KC to help with early spring work, check cattle, and stay close to the independent roundup planned by the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association. He was known in Johnson County as a strong hand, a man who could ride broncs, handle cattle, and speak clearly for small outfits at meetings in Buffalo. In the gray hour before sunrise, the invaders dismounted in the shelter of coulees and draws around the cabin. Wolcott, Canton, and the other leaders spread their men so that rifles could cover every side of the small ranch. Some riders led horses into patches of brush and tied them out of sight. Others crawled forward to positions behind logs, rocks, and fence posts, They checked the actions of their Winchesters, worked cartridges into place, and settled with their sights trained on the door and windows of the shack. Their plan called for a surprise assault that would kill everyone inside before the targets could put up serious resistance or send word to friends. As the first light touched the eastern sky, Nick Ray rose, pulled on his boots, and stepped to the door. He had spent the night coughing and felt sick, but he meant to fetch water and start breakfast. Champion still lay on the bunk with a blanket pulled high and a revolver close at hand. The two hired men stirred in their blankets on the floor. When Ray pushed open the door and stepped into the cold air, a rifle cracked from the brush. The bullet slammed into his stomach and turned him half around. He staggered back through the doorway and collapsed inside, gasping and bleeding onto the plank floor. The shot woke Champion completely. He snapped fully upright, grabbed his revolver, and dragged Ray away from the entrance while bullets began to punch through the log walls. Glass shattered from the small window as rounds smashed into the cabin from multiple directions. The two unarmed workers threw themselves to the floor, hands over their heads, splinters raining down around them. Champion fired through the window and door opening in quick succession, aiming at muzzle flashes and movement in the brush rather than clear shapes. He knew from the volume of fire that the attackers far outnumbered the men inside. Within minutes, the battle settled into a brutal exchange. The invaders poured steady rifle fire into the cabin, concentrating on the door, the window, and the thin spots between logs. Champion returned shots with a Winchester and his revolver, shifting position to avoid presenting a fixed target. He used the table, the stove, and the bunk as partial cover, ducking low as bullets whined overhead and slammed into wood, metal, and bedding. Ray lay on the floor near the bunk, bleeding heavily and unable to move his legs, whispering that he was done for while Champion tried to watch every side of the room at once. Smoke from gunfire hung thick inside the cramped space and stung the men's eyes. Powder stains spread over the doorframe and window ledge. Champion forced himself to think in short, hard steps. He knew that he had to keep firing to convince the attackers that the cabin was still a live position. He also knew that the two unarmed laborers had no place in the fight. When there was a brief lull in the shooting, he called to the men on the ground and shouted that they should try to get out and show that they carried no weapons. Outside, some of the invaders called out that they would spare the two workers if they came out unarmed. The men inside decided that staying in the burning path of rifle fire would finish them as surely as stepping through the door might, so they took the chance. One after another, they crawled to the entrance, pushed the door open, and stepped into view with their hands raised. Shots snapped close, but the attackers let them move away under guard instead of killing them outright. The two were sent off on foot under orders to leave the country. One of them later reached a distant ranch and spread the first word that a large armed party had struck the KC. After the laborers left, only Champion and the dying Ray remained inside. The invaders closed in tighter around the cabin, lifting their aim to rake the roof and the upper walls as well as the door. Champion knelt beside Ray for a moment, spoke to him quietly, and then went back to firing through cracks and gaps. At some point, Ray's breathing stopped and his face slackened, but Champion had no time to do more than pull a blanket across the body. He knew that if he let up, the men outside would rush the door or set the building on fire without delay. Between volleys, Champion took out a small notebook and pencil that he carried and began to jot down brief notes each time the fight paused. He recorded that Nick had been shot, that the invaders had surrounded the place before dawn, that he had seen men in slickers and masks, and that they had allowed the two workers to leave. He wrote that the attackers had tried to set the cabin on fire and that he had shot one of them from the doorway. The notes were short, written in a careful hand in what he believed might be the last hours of his life. The day dragged on with no sign of relief. The sun climbed higher, and the snow patches around the cabin softened into wet crust. but inside the shack the air grew stale and close. Champion rationed cartridges, counting them and placing them so that he could reach them while staying low. Occasionally he glimpsed a hat, a sleeve, or the edge of a rifle barrel behind brush or a haystack and fired at once. Outside, the invaders shifted their positions, moving from cover to cover, trying to find angles that would let them shoot down into the room. More than one of them took a bullet or splinter wound as Champion's shots found their targets. Late in the morning or early afternoon, the attackers tried fire in earnest. A group of them dragged hay and dry brush close to the cabin wall from an angle that gave them partial cover. Others kept up steady shooting to pin Champion down. Once the material lay piled against the logs, men thrust flaming brands and burning bundles into the hay and stepped back as it caught. Smoke began to seep through cracks between the logs and into the room. Champion saw tongues of flame climbing the outside walls through the window and heard the crackle of fire as it took hold in the dry wood. He fought the flames as long as he could, dashing water from the cabin's scant supply and smothering spots with blankets and clothing. Every time he moved toward the burning wall, bullets tore through the planks around him. The combination of choking smoke, heat, and continuous gunfire pressed him from all sides. He wrote another note in his book, recording that the house was on fire and that he could see men moving behind the brush and along the ridge, then picked up his rifle again. As afternoon deepened, the roof began to burn in earnest. Smoke poured through the interior, forcing Champion to crouch near the floor to breathe. The flames overhead crackled and popped, sending down sparks and embers that landed on the mattress, the table, and the bodies on the floor. He stamped out small fires with his boots and beat others with a coat, but the effort could not last. Outside, the invaders pulled back slightly to avoid the worst of the heat while keeping rifles trained. They knew that sooner or later the man inside would have to leave or die where he lay. At last, when the interior of the cabin became unlivable, Champion faced his final choice. He could stay inside and burn or be shot through the walls, or he could step through the door and try to break through the ring of rifles. He took up his Winchester and revolver, checked that each held cartridges, and moved toward the doorway through a haze of smoke and falling embers. His last written note stated in plain terms that he expected to die fighting and that he believed he had done his best to hold off the men outside. When the door swung open one final time, Champion stepped out into the open yard with his rifle in his hands. His clothes and hair were singed, his face blackened by smoke and powder, but he walked upright. For a brief instant there was a pause as both sides saw each other clearly. Then rifles cracked from every side. Bullets tore into his chest and limbs and spun him sideways. He tried to return fire, but the rounds hit too fast and too hard. He collapsed near the doorway, dead in the open ground within sight of the creek and the low hills that held the men who had come to kill him. After the firing stopped, the invaders moved cautiously toward the burned cabin. Flames still licked at the roof and walls, and smoke poured out of gaping holes where bullets and fire had opened the structure. They dragged Champion's body clear of the heat, stripped away some of his burned clothing, and examined the wounds. Several bullets had passed through him. He showed powder burns on his face and hands from the hours of close firing inside. They left Nick Ray's corpse in the smoking ruins. Nearby lay cartridge cases, spent bullets flattened against logs, and scattered personal possessions charred by flame. Someone among the invaders pinned a rough sign to Champion's body that warned others against cattle theft, using his corpse as a message to any small rancher or cowboy who might think of resisting the stock growers. They searched the remains of the cabin and found the small notebook with its brief entries from the siege, its pages scorched at the edges but still legible. That notebook would eventually reach other hands and give Johnson County residents a clear, first-hand record of how Champion had spent his final hours. With the KC cabin burned, the invaders regrouped. They counted their own wounded, gathered dropped equipment, and rounded up frightened horses that had pulled against their ties during the gunfire and smoke. They had lost hours in the fight and expended a large amount of ammunition, but they had achieved the immediate goal of killing 2 men who sat high on their list. From their perspective, the attack at the KC showed that a small homesteader could not stand against the organized force of the association. They did not yet grasp how deeply the details of that day would stir the people of Johnson County once the story reached Buffalo. By evening, the column left the charred ruins of the KC Ranch behind and rode toward the TA Ranch on Crazy Woman Creek, a larger spread that they chose as a temporary base for the next phase of their campaign. Behind them, they left 2 dead men, a burned cabin and a scarred patch of ground marked by boot prints, hoof tracks, and blood. The smell of smoke and burned flesh hung over the site as night closed in. In the days that followed, riders from the surrounding country would come to that place and see with their own eyes what the invaders had done there at dawn. April 9th, 1892, a freckled rancher named Jack Flagg drove his team along the Powder River with his teenage stepson beside him on the wagon seat and saw smoke lifting in a hard column from the direction of the KC line camp. The air still held the chill of early spring, and the wagon wheels cut shallow grooves in ground that had only begun to thaw. Flagg had expected a quiet trip past Champion's Range on his way toward Buffalo. Instead, he saw flickers of flame and heard the distant, uneven crack of rifles carrying thin across the open country. He pulled the team up, listened for a moment, and knew that what he heard was not target shooting or a casual quarrel. It was sustained fire from many guns focused on a single point. He turned the team off the main track and eased the wagon toward a low rise that gave a view over the KC buildings. As they topped the rise, he and the boy looked down toward the cabin and saw riders in slickers moving around the yard, the line shack throwing smoke and flame from its roof. Flagg counted more horses and men than any ordinary roundup crew would bring to a single camp. The pattern of their positions around the buildings told him that they had come to kill, not to talk. He watched long enough to understand that whoever remained alive in the cabin had no chance if help did not come quickly. Then he snapped the reins, turned the team away from the gunfire, and drove as hard as the horses could pull toward Buffalo. The run from the Powder River country into town took hours, every minute marked by the beat of hooves and the grind of iron rims over frozen ruts. Flagg pushed the team without rest, his mind running ahead to the faces of the men he knew in Buffalo, who would have to hear that an armed force had crossed the county line and burned a ranch house with people inside. His stepson clung to the seat, teeth clenched against the jolts. By the time the wagon rolled into town, both horses were lathered, their flanks dark with sweat despite the cold air, and Flagg's voice was hoarse from shouting at them to keep going. In Buffalo, the day had started in ordinary fashion. Storekeepers swept boardwalks in front of their doors. A blacksmith hammered shoes in a forge that glowed orange in the dim light of his shop. Women carried buckets from wells and traded quiet talk along the main street. Inside the Johnson County Courthouse, Sheriff William Red Angus worked through routine matters, reviewing warrants and speaking with deputies about minor cases. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a heavy mustache, a temper that rose quickly, and a steady sense of which fights mattered. When Flagg stepped through the door and shouted that gunmen had Champion's place surrounded and burning, Angus rose from his chair before the words were fully out. Flagg's story spilled out in broken phrases as Angus and others pressed him for details. He described the number of riders, the way they had ringed the cabin, the fire on the roof, and the volume of rifle fire he had heard. He told Angus that these were not a handful of local toughs, but a large organized force, strangers mixed with men he recognized as stock detectives and association riders. The sheriff listened hard, weighing the rancher's reputation for plain speaking against the enormity of what he described. Then he walked to the courthouse door, looked down the street and made a decision that would bring nearly every armed man in the county to horse within hours. Angus ordered the courthouse bell rung and sent deputies running to the livery barns and saloons with instructions to summon every able-bodied man in town. The bell's harsh clang cut through normal sounds and brought people out of stores and homes. Merchants closed their doors and reached for rifles kept under counters. Cowboys sleeping off trail work in cheap hotel rooms pulled on boots and belts and headed for the street. Men who had voted Angus into office and men who disagreed with him politically all heard the same call. An armed band had killed in the South and was heading toward Buffalo. On the courthouse steps, Angus raised his voice so that men gathering below could hear him over the bell and the growing noise. He told them that a force of gunmen had invaded Johnson County and killed men at the KC line camp. He said that as sheriff he was raising a posse to arrest the killers and protect the town, and that any man willing to serve under legal authority would be sworn in on the spot. Volunteers stepped forward in twos and threes, faces set, some with fear in their eyes and others with anger. Angus's deputies lined them up, took their names, and administered the oath that made them temporary officers of the county. Within a short time, the first wave of roughly 100 men had been sworn and sent to ready their horses and gear. Ranchers in town on business mounted and rode out to alert neighbors. Telegraph messages went out from Buffalo toward nearby points that still had working lines, calling men from ranches along Clear Creek, Crazy Woman Creek, and the Powder to come armed to the county seat. The telegraph south toward Casper lay silent because invaders had cut wires along their route, but riders could still carry word across the nearer ranch country. As the day wore on, men poured into Buffalo from every direction, some leading spare horses, many carrying Winchesters and shotguns that had seen earlier use on cattle drives and hunting trips. While Angus gathered his force, news of Champion's death and the burning of the KC spread in fragments. The two laborers who had escaped the cabin told their story at a ranch house many miles from town, and then moved farther from the danger. Riders visiting the ruins later that day saw Champion's body and the charred remains of the line shack. They brought back descriptions of a sign pinned to his chest and of cartridge cases scattered over the yard. By evening, Buffalo knew not only that an invasion had begun, but that one of the most respected small stockmen in the county lay dead on the ground where he had made his last stand. Angus understood that speed mattered as much as numbers. Every hour that passed gave the invaders a chance to reach Buffalo, strike scattered ranches along the way, or slip out of the county without facing local law. He decided to move as soon as he had a core body of armed riders rather than wait for every outlying rancher to arrive. By nightfall on April 9th, he had roughly 200 men under oath or on their way. He gave orders that the main body of the posse would leave town at first light the next morning, with smaller groups riding ahead during the night to watch roads and carry messages. In the homes of Buffalo that night, women and children packed supplies and helped husbands and fathers gather equipment. Many men slept in their clothes, rifles close at hand, ready to mount when Angus called. Some left handwritten notes on kitchen tables in case they did not return. The town's few lamps burned late as families prayed or sat in silence, listening for hoofbeats outside. On the hills around Buffalo, riders posted as pickets watched for any sign that the invaders might approach under cover of darkness. The expected attack on the town did not come. The cattlemen's column had turned away from Buffalo and taken shelter at the TA Ranch on Crazy Woman Creek, unaware that the whole county was beginning to move against them. At dawn on April 10th, the main posse rode out of Buffalo in a long, uneven line. Men wore whatever gear they owned. Some had cartridge belts well stocked with rifle and pistol rounds. Others carried their extra ammunition in pockets or tied in cloth bags. Saddles showed the marks of long use on roundups and freighting jobs. A few riders had good army carbines. Most carried Winchesters in saddle scabbards and revolvers in worn holsters. Angus rode near the front, flanked by deputies who tried to keep some order in the column. The long line of horses and men wound south across Clear Creek, past scattered ranch houses whose occupants watched from doorways, and headed toward the country where the KC cabin had burned the day before. As the posse moved, more men joined from side roads and draws. Ranchers who had not reached Buffalo in time rode straight from their homes to intercept the column, falling into place without ceremony. Cowboys on spring work left cattle in temporary holding spots and trailed after the main body. In some stretches, the column spread out over such distance that men in the rear could barely see those at the front. Dust rose where the ground had dried, mixing with patches of lingering snowmelt that turned low spots into mud. The speed of the march varied with terrain, but the overall pace remained urgent. On the way south and west, Angus sent scouts ahead to gather information on the invaders' route. They followed fresh trails of many horses and several wagons, the tracks cut deep into soft ground. The sign told a clear story. A large, heavy column had moved through recently, then turned off the main road toward Crazy Woman Creek. At ranches along the way, frightened families confirmed that an armed party had passed and that some riders had spoken of going on to Buffalo to clean out rustlers and hang men whose names resembled those on Canton's list. None had expected that the county would answer with such a large force of its own. Through that long day, the posse halted only briefly to rest horses and let men drink from creeks and refill canteens. At each stop, Angus and his leading deputies studied maps and talked with locals who knew every bend and draw. They aimed not only to catch the invaders, but to cut them off from open country where they might scatter and escape. The TA ranch lay in a position that could be approached from several directions across broken ground. Angus planned to use that terrain to his advantage, sending wings of the posse to swing wide while the main body drove forward. By late afternoon, advance riders brought word that the invaders had taken shelter at the TA, using its buildings and corrals as a stronghold. The ranch sat along Crazy Woman Creek, with a log barn, house, and outbuildings grouped near the water and low hills rising beyond. The invaders had already begun to fortify the place, pulling wagons into defensive positions and posting guards along ridges and fence lines. They had chosen the spot to avoid being caught in open ground on the road to Buffalo. They did not yet know how many armed men were riding against them, but they understood that Johnson County law was on their trail. Angus halted the main body of the posse at a distance where they could not be seen clearly from the ranch and called a council. Riders gathered around, horses blowing hard from the day's march. The sheriff laid out the information from scouts and from ranchers along the way. He told them that the invaders had already killed Champion and Ray, and that they were now holed up with plenty of rifles and ammunition. He reminded the posse that their task as deputies of Johnson County was to arrest the killers, not to lynch them. But he did not hide the danger. Any attempt to storm the TA directly across open ground would bring heavy casualties. They needed to use cover, distance, and numbers. Small groups of men were assigned specific roles. Some were sent wide around the flanks to close off possible escape routes. Others were ordered to work their way forward using gullies, brush, and low rises to get within rifle range without presenting clear targets. A handful of experienced marksmen took positions on higher ground where they could observe movements in and around the TA buildings and direct fire if necessary. Behind them, the main body of the posse prepared to spread out into a loose ring, tightening slowly until every path out of the ranch yard lay under the sights of homesteaders, cowboys, and townmen sworn in as deputies. As evening approached on April 10th, the first shots cracked back and forth between outer elements of the posse and the invaders' guards. Men on both sides felt the change from talk and movement to open exchange of fire. The settlers fired single-aimed rounds, testing distance and positions. The invaders answered with bursts from Winchesters, trying to push the posse back before the circle closed. No one yet pressed a full assault, but both forces now knew that they faced determined foes. Smoke from scattered shots drifted over the creek bottom, and horses snorted and tossed their heads at the smell and sound. Night fell cold over Crazy Woman Creek, with both sides dug in as best they could for the hours of darkness. The invaders slept in shifts in the TA barn and house, some keeping watch from windows and loopholes cut in the walls. They knew they were outnumbered and far from friendly ground. The posse huddled in makeshift camps scattered across the surrounding hills and low draws, men wrapping themselves in blankets and coats, rifles across their knees, waiting for dawn. Fires were kept low or hidden behind terrain to avoid drawing concentrated fire from the ranch. In those hours, the numbers on Canton's list and the names on Angus's oath sheets had finally met face to face. On one side stood 52 invaders, including some of the wealthiest cattlemen in Wyoming, their top hands and hired Texans. On the other side stood roughly 200 deputies, many of them small ranchers and townsmen who had seen friends lynched or shot from ambush in the years leading up to this moment. The ground between them was broken pasture, corrals, and creek bottom, lined with brush and rock that would soon bear the marks of shovels and bullets. With the first gray light of April 11th creeping over the Bighorn foothills, men on both sides rose stiffly from bedrolls and barn lofts, checked weapons, and stared across a landscape that had changed overnight. What had begun as a secret expedition launched from Cheyenne now faced the armed weight of a county that had refused to yield. The siege of the TA ranch was about to begin, and neither the invaders inside nor the deputies outside could yet know that federal cavalry would eventually ride into that same valley to decide who walked away and who rode in chains. April 11th, 1892. The first shots at the TA ranch cracked across Crazy Woman Creek before the frost had finished lifting from the grass. The invaders had reached the ranch in the dark hours and taken it over, pushing the resident hands into corners and turning a working place into a fortified camp. By daylight, they had horses in the corrals, wagons pulled into rough barricades, and men posted at every window and doorway of the long log barn and house that stood near the creek. Inside the barn, the smell of hay, horses, and cold sweat mixed with the sharper scent of gun oil. Texas cowboys and Cheyenne cattlemen shared space in the loft and along the walls, checking rifles and revolvers, sliding cartridges into belts, and peering through fresh-cut loopholes between the logs. Some of the men had already learned that this expedition carried its own hazards. Jim Dudley, a heavy Texas gunman, lay on a makeshift bed in one corner with his leg wrapped, the wound from a rifle that had fallen and gone off when his horse bucked on the way to the ranch. He groaned when he shifted, the bandage soaked through, and two companions discussed in low voices how soon they could get him to Fort McKinney before infection finished what the bullet had started. Around the buildings, invaders took cover behind haystacks, wagons, and fence posts, watching the approaches through the low hills. They knew that the posse from Buffalo was somewhere out there, following the tracks of many horses and heavy wagons. Each man on guard scanned the skyline for movement, knowing that once the first riders showed themselves, the siege would begin in earnest. Their leaders, Frank Wolcott and Frank Canton, moved from position to position, giving short orders and pointing out angles of fire. They understood that they had put themselves deep in hostile country with limited food and water, and that their only advantage lay in concentrated fire and solid timber walls. When the Johnson County posse finally appeared, it did not come as a tight, drilled column, but as a long, uneven line of riders spreading across the ridges and draws. Men who had ridden out of Buffalo the previous day now arrived in waves, some already in position from the night before, others just reaching the outer ground around the ranch. They dismounted on high spots and in shallow coulees, tying horses in clusters behind cover. The first shots came from rangefinders on both sides, single cracks as men tested distances with their Winchesters and watched where dust kicked up or splinters jumped from fences and logs. Within a short time, the loose ring of deputies tightened into a true encirclement. Sheriff Red Angus and his closest deputies directed men to spread along the higher ground north and south of the ranch, to take positions along the creek bank, and to close gaps where invaders might try to break out. Many of the older men in the posse had served in the Civil War and understood how to lay out a siege. Under their direction, settlers began scraping shallow rifle pits into the soggy ground with shovels, picks, and even tin plates. In some spots, they stacked sod and rail fence pieces to thicken their cover. Mud soaked into cuffs and knees as they worked, and the damp earth chilled fingers that had already been stiff from the long ride. As the ring settled, the gunfire intensified. From the barn and house, invaders fired through windows, doorways, and the crude gun ports they had chopped between logs. Bullets hissed out across the open pasture and along the creek, flattening against rocks, cutting brush, and punching into the dirt where posse men hugged their shallow trenches. The deputies answered with careful shots of their own, aiming whenever they saw a hat brim, a shoulder, or the faint outline of a face in a window. The snap and echo of rifles rolled back and forth through the valley, a steady exchange rather than a brief clash. To deny the invaders any chance at a mounted breakout, the posse focused some of its first concentrated fire on the corrals. Horses reared and screamed as bullets tore through rails and flesh. Many animals went down in the dust and mud, thrashing helplessly as more rounds struck. Others broke loose and ran wild before collapsing. By the end of that work, most of the invaders' mounts lay dead or scattered, and the ground near the corrals was churned with hoof marks, blood, and broken boards. The deputies knew they would be accused later of cruelty to stock, but they also knew that men behind those walls could not ride through a tight ring of rifles without horses. As the day wore on, more settlers and cowhands arrived to swell the posse's numbers. Some carried worn but serviceable rifles. Others brought newly issued firearms and ammunition that a Buffalo merchant, Robert Foote, had supplied from his store at his own expense. Crates of cartridges were opened behind the lines, and deputies filled belts and pockets with fresh rounds. Men who had brought only a few shells from home now had enough to stay in the fight for as long as it lasted. The flow of reinforcements changed the balance. The 50 men inside the TA ranch now faced several times their number outside, all under the legal authority of the Johnson County Sheriff. Inside the barn and house, conditions tightened. The invaders had food in the ranch storerooms and in their captured supply wagons, but every step between buildings meant crossing spaces watched by hidden rifles. They moved in short dashes, bent low, using wagons and stacks as cover. Buckets of water were carried in from the creek at night or during brief lulls, each trip a risk. When bullets hit the log walls, chips snapped free and flew across rooms, stinging faces and hands. The wounded groaned in corners where blankets had been spread on hay bales. Outside, a ranch boy who had been caught in the buildings when the invaders took over tried to make himself useful, and during one attempt to handle an old shotgun he found in the loft. A stray bullet came through a window and cut into his neck. He spent the rest of the siege lying on the floor, half-conscious, while men stepped around him. Near the end of the first day, a cluster of invaders attempted to break the line. They left the barn under the cover of heavy fire from their comrades, moving in a group toward an opening in the ring where the ground fell into a shallow swale. Deputies on that side saw the movement and shouted warnings. Rifles on the posse's flank and center swung toward the running men. Shots came in from several angles, and more than one invader fell, tumbling into the grass. Those who survived the first rush dropped flat and crawled back toward the buildings, dragging at least one wounded companion. The breakout failed, and the deputies read that failure as proof that their line could hold. Night dropped cold on the 11th, with both sides still facing each other across the creek bottom. Fires inside the barn cast faint light through the cracks in the logs. Outside, the posse built small, shielded fires where men could warm hands and heat coffee in blackened pots while staying below the line of sight from the ranch. Guards watched through the darkness, listening for hoofbeats or the scrape of a man moving beyond his proper place. Some deputies catnapped with rifles across their chests, waking at every shout or new volley. Inside the barn, invaders slept in shifts, boots on, rifles within reach, knowing that any slip in alertness could invite a night assault. By the morning of April 12th, the siege had settled into a grinding routine. With first light, positions were checked and corrected. Deputies shifted slightly to take advantage of new cover and to seal any weak spots discovered in the night. More rifle pits were dug, deeper and better located, and some men roofed them with planks and sod taken from nearby fences and sheds, leaving firing slits toward the ranch. From these dugouts, they could fire repeatedly with only a small portion of their heads exposed. To keep up pressure, the posse rotated men forward and back so that tired shooters could rest and eat while others took their places under fire. The invaders responded by tightening their internal defenses. Wagons were taken apart and their running gear and planks used to reinforce walls and create new firing positions inside the barn. Bales of hay were dragged into position to stop bullets. Men shuffled between levels in the barn and the main house, designating some as sharpshooters to watch specific sectors where deputies had been most aggressive. A few of the Texans muttered openly that the expedition had turned into a trap. Association officers reminded them that the state government remained on their side and that help would come if they could only hold out long enough. During that second day, casualties mounted inside the ranch yard. One gunman, Alex Lowther, attempted to shift positions under fire and shot himself while crawling, the bullet entering through his lower body and leaving him in agony. Others took grazing wounds from bullets that came through roofs or walls at odd angles. No one inside could stand upright near a window or doorway without inviting a shot. Outside, the deputies stayed low enough and used enough cover that no deaths were recorded in their ranks during the siege, though several men had close calls from splinters and ricochets. At some point during the long stretch of April 12th, one of the invaders, cowboy and scout Mike Shanzi, slipped out of the encircled ranch. He used his knowledge of the ground, and a moment when the gunfire slackened to crawl through brush and drop into a shallow side draw, then worked his way beyond the outer line under cover of the terrain. Once clear, he rode hard for a telegraph point near Fort McKinney. From there, he sent a message that described an armed expedition of dozens of stockmen besieged by a sheriff and a large force of armed settlers, claimed that numerous men had already been killed, and warned that if either side gained full advantage, there would be no mercy for prisoners. The message framed the invaders as legitimate stock owners under attack and argued that civil authority on the ground could not control the situation. While Shanzi rode for help, the men he left behind listened to the steady buzzing of bullets against the barn walls and watched the posse's earthworks creep closer. The deputies had enough veterans among them to understand that time favored the side that held the outer ring and had open access to the countryside. By late on the 12th, more rifle pits had been dug closer to the ranch yard, and the sound of picks and shovels carried faintly between volleys. The invaders knew that if the ring closed too tightly, every door and window would be under such close fire that movement inside the buildings would become nearly impossible. On April 13th, the balance shifted again when the posse decided to prepare a direct assault tool. A local blacksmith, Rap Brown, had experimented unsuccessfully with building a makeshift cannon, an effort that ended when the improvised piece burst and nearly injured the men testing it. After that failure, Brown turned to a different idea. Using running gear captured from the invaders' own supply wagons, he and other men constructed a rolling shield, a heavy wooden structure built of logs and planks tall enough to shelter crouching men and mounted on the wagon frames. The posse began to refer to it as the Go Devil or the Ark of Safety. The plan was simple and brutal. A picked group of deputies would crouch behind the moving fort as it rolled toward the ranch buildings, using its thick front to block rifle fire. Once they reached effective throwing distance, they would toss dynamite charges taken from the captured wagons into the barn and house, forcing the invaders either to flee out into the open or to be killed where they lay. Men selected for the task understood that even with the rolling shield, the advance would be dangerous. They worked to strengthen the front and sides, testing how it moved over rough ground, and checked the fuses and sticks of dynamite they meant to carry inside. On the ground around the TA, word of the new device spread quickly through the posse. Some deputies welcomed anything that might bring the siege to a close before fatigue, hunger, and weather wore them down further. Others worried quietly about the number of men who would die in the barn if the dynamite did its work. The mood in the ranks had hardened since Champion's death at the KC Ranch, and many were prepared to see the invaders killed to the last man. Yet Angus continued to insist that his goal remained arrest rather than slaughter, even as he allowed preparations for the Go Devil to continue. Inside the ranch, the invaders watched the construction of the rolling fort with growing concern. Through gaps in the walls, they could see men dragging heavy timbers and wagon parts into a squat shape that inched toward them each time deputies pushed it forward for a test. They could guess its purpose, especially once they realized that dynamite from their own captured stores had gone missing. Some of the cattlemen who had expected a quick show of power and a rapid return to Cheyenne now spoke openly of the possibility that they might die in a log barn on Crazy Woman Creek, far from the offices and clubs where they had drawn up their plans. By midday on April 13th, Shanzi's telegraphed plea had reached men in positions of power far from the mud and smoke at the TA Ranch. Acting Governor Amos Barber and allies in the state's political leadership forwarded the alarm to federal authorities, describing an armed conflict in Johnson County as an insurrection, and emphasizing the danger that many lives would be lost if the siege continued. In Washington, President Benjamin Harrison authorized the use of troops from nearby Fort McKinney to restore order. Orders went out to the 6th Cavalry to ride at once to the TA Ranch, take charge, and prevent further bloodshed. That afternoon, as the posse readied the Ark of Safety for its full advance and men inside the barn braced for a final assault, dust appeared on the horizon from the direction of Fort McKinney. Riders on both sides saw the approaching column of soldiers, 3 troops of cavalry moving at a steady pace, guidons visible above the line of horsemen. The sound of their approach carried over the lower crackle of individual rifle shots. Fire from both sides slackened as men lowered weapons to stare at the newcomers. The cavalry halted within speaking distance but outside the immediate line of fire. Their commanding officer, Colonel J.J. Van Horn, sent word to Sheriff Angus and to the leaders inside the TA Ranch that federal troops now held authority on the field. Angus rode forward to meet the soldiers, accompanied by deputies who had spent the last days in trenches and behind brush. Wolcott and Canton stepped out from the barn side to parley under the watchful eyes of hundreds of armed settlers and dozens of professional soldiers. Van Horn laid out the federal position plainly. The troops had come on direct presidential orders to stop the fighting. The invaders were to surrender their arms and equipment into military custody and place themselves under the protection of the United States Army. The posse, for its part, was ordered to disperse and allow the prisoners to be escorted to Fort McKinney without interference. Angus argued that as sheriff he held legal authority over the men who had killed citizens of his county and that he intended to arrest them. Van Horn responded that the army would hold the prisoners for civil authorities in due course, but that immediate disarmament and removal from the ranch were necessary to prevent a massacre. The deputies listened with mixed feelings as word of this exchange traveled back through their lines. Many felt that victory had been snatched from their hands at the moment when the ark of safety was nearly ready to roll. They had endured days of cold mud and fire to bring the invaders to bay, and now saw soldiers intervening to shield those same men from the full consequences of their actions. Yet few among them were prepared to fire on federal troops. Angus gauged his riders and recognized that if he rejected the army's terms, the field around the TA might turn into a three-sided battle. After hard thought and consultation with leading citizens in the posse, Angus agreed to stand down. The deputies maintained their positions while the 6th Cavalry moved into the ranch yard. Soldiers took up guard posts around the barn and house as Wolcott's men filed out under watch, stacking rifles and revolvers under army supervision. The invaders carried their wounded with them, including men hurt in accidents and in failed breakout attempts. Once disarmed, they were formed into a guarded column. Not one deputy fired a shot as they marched away under cavalry escort. By evening of April 13th, the siege of the TA ranch was over. The rifle pits around the ranch still scarred the ground, and dead horses lay near the corrals, stiffening in the cooling air. The ark of safety stood unused, its heavy front dark with mud where men had tested its movement. Deputies broke camp slowly, some kicking at the sides of the abandoned rolling fort in frustration, others staring silently at the ranch buildings where men who had come to hang their neighbors had just walked out under the flag rather than under ropes. Families in Johnson County would later argue for years over whether justice or politics had prevailed that day. What could not be argued was that a private army of cattle barons had been stopped only when hundreds of local settlers had dug in around a working ranch and refused to give ground, forcing the federal government itself to intervene. When the 6th Cavalry formed the invaders into a guarded column on April 13, 1892, and led them away from the TA ranch, the men of Johnson County watched them go with rifles still in hand. The deputies had dug trenches, killed horses, and held the ring for 3 days, only to see the same cattle barons and hired guns march out under army protection instead of being marched to the Johnson County jail in irons. Dust from the cavalry column hung over Crazy Woman Creek as the soldiers guided the prisoners north toward Fort McKinney, their saddles creaking and scabbarded carbines bumping against their legs. Behind them, the rifle pits, dead animals, and torn fences marked where the settlers had stood against the private army. At Fort McKinney, the first news that the invaders were coming brought crowds of armed civilians from both sides of the conflict onto the road and into the brush around the post. Men loyal to the cattle interests and men who had relatives in the posse all converged, some hoping to see the prisoners held on the parade ground, others ready to argue for their release. Officers at the fort saw immediately that keeping the prisoners in that environment would invite a riot. Within a short time, the decision came down to move them farther from Johnson County. Under guard, the invaders were escorted out again, this time toward the rail line that would carry them south to Cheyenne and the larger post at Fort D.A. Russell. When the prisoners arrived at Fort D.A. Russell, Army regulations met political reality. Officially, they were in custody on serious charges, including murder and conspiracy. Yet they were not treated like ordinary felons in a territorial jail. They were housed in military quarters and allowed considerable freedom inside the post. Photograph copies from that spring would later show well-dressed cattlemen standing in groups with soldiers, hats tilted at their accustomed angles, faces set but unmarked by the weeks of siege their opponents had endured in rifle pits. During daylight hours, many of the invaders moved around the grounds under light supervision, on the understanding that they would return to their assigned quarters at night. In Buffalo, the knowledge that the men who had burned the KC ranch and shot down Nate Champion were living in relative comfort hundreds of miles away, under federal guard, deepened the anger that had already built across Johnson County. Sheriff Red Angus and County Attorney William Bennett prepared to press charges anyway. Bennett rode and took testimony from men who had seen the gunman on the Powder River and at the TA, collecting sworn statements that described the siege in careful detail. Deputies forwarded physical evidence gathered after the invasion, including papers taken from Frank Canton's luggage when the Army relieved him of his gripsack. Inside, investigators found the list of 70 Johnson County residents marked for death or capture, a list of ranches to be burned, and written promises that the Texas gunmen would receive $5 a day plus a $50 bonus for every person they killed who appeared on the list. Newspapers around the country printed those details as they surfaced. Stories in Cheyenne, Denver, and eastern cities described the contract terms and the presence of leading stockmen on the expedition. Reports noted that detectives and association officers had expected to continue their work beyond Johnson County into Natrona and Converse counties, with plans to reach as far as Casper and Douglas. Johnson County residents who had never seen the death list read their own neighbors' names in print and understood how far the plan had extended. The evidence also named more than 20 prominent cattlemen and investors in Cheyenne and Omaha as financial backers of the invasion. Johnson County officials pushed for broad indictments. A grand jury seated in Laramie County considered charges not only against the men physically captured at the TA Ranch, but also against the association leaders who had subscribed money, drawn up plans, and recruited Texans. Murder charges were prepared for the killing of Nate Champion and Nick Ray. Additional counts covered attempted murder, arson at the KC Ranch, conspiracy to commit murder, and participation in an armed invasion of a county under color of private authority. For a brief period in late spring 1892, it appeared that the legal system might hold at least some of the planners and financiers to account. The cattle interests answered with lawyers and political allies. Attorneys for the prisoners argued that pre-trial publicity in Johnson County and in parts of Wyoming made a fair trial impossible there, and pressed for changes of venue and delays. Supporters in Cheyenne tried to shift public attention toward claims that Buffalo had been dominated by rustlers, and that the invaders had ridden north only because local juries refused to convict cattle thieves. In private offices and club rooms, association leaders met with friendly officials to find procedural ways of blunting the prosecutions. At each step, the weight of their money and connections pressed against the narrow resources of a sparsely populated county trying to prosecute men with statewide influence. One of the most effective tools turned out to be simple cost. Under Wyoming law, Johnson County bore primary responsibility for the expenses of criminal prosecutions arising from the invasion, even if the prisoners were held and tried in another county. Housing the invaders at Fort D.A. Russell cost more each week as the Army submitted bills for board, guard duty, and other services. By that summer, those charges had climbed past $18,000, a heavy blow for a county whose tax base rested on small ranches, scattered businesses, and hard-pressed families still recovering from range losses. County commissioners struggled to meet ordinary obligations such as road maintenance and poor relief. Adding large prosecution costs threatened open insolvency. As Johnson County debated special levies and emergency funding, the prisoners and their backers worked to secure bail. Courts allowed many of the invaders to post bonds and live in relative freedom while awaiting trial, on the understanding that they would return when called. Association members in Cheyenne and elsewhere put up substantial sums. Some of the Texans used that freedom to slip away to their home state and never came back. Others stayed near Cheyenne, confident that delays and political maneuvers would eventually erase the threat of long prison terms. While lawyers argued and legislators haggled over money, Violence tied to the war continued in Wyoming. In May 1892, Deputy United States Marshal George Wellman, who had ridden with the invaders, was ambushed and killed on the road near Buffalo while traveling under federal orders. He died with rifle wounds in his body, the only United States Marshal killed during the Range War. His death brought another wave of headlines and hardened attitudes on both sides. To supporters of the cattle interests, it proved that Johnson County contained men willing to kill officers of the federal government. To many settlers, it stood as another entry in a long line of bloodshed that began with lynchings and continued through assassinations and open invasion. Tension spread even to the army posts that had tried to separate the sides. In the summer of 1892, a fire damaged the post exchange at Fort McKinney, followed by a homemade explosive device planted in the cavalry barracks. When it detonated, it shattered the left arm of Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, an officer already known for his earlier role in negotiating with Geronimo. The wound ended his cavalry career. The blast deepened Army concern that some civilians in the region were prepared to strike even at federal troops they considered hostile to their interests in the war. In response to the continuing strain, the War Department shifted units. The white troopers of the 6th Cavalry were reassigned away from Fort McKinney. In their place came companies of the 9th Cavalry, black soldiers widely known as Buffalo Soldiers, under Major Charles Isley. They marched into a region where disgust at how the invaders had been treated mixed with racial prejudice among some white settlers. The 9th Cavalry established an outpost called Camp Bettins near the rail point at Suggs. Their presence brought new friction. In one incident, a confrontation between townsmen and troopers escalated into a brief gunfight that left one soldier dead and others wounded. The legal cases against the invaders dragged on into 1893 without a single major trial reaching a jury. Repeated continuances, disputes over venue, and the unresolved question of who would pay court and jail costs kept pushing dates back. In Cheyenne, judges showed little urgency in forcing matters to conclusion. In Buffalo, Johnson County taxpayers saw bills mount while their own causes, from road repairs to school funding, went partially unmet. Reports circulated that if the county pushed too hard to bring the invaders to trial, state officials might simply let them go and leave the county saddled with debts it could not pay. By spring of 1893, the pressure broke. Courts dismissed key cases on the stated ground that Johnson County had refused or failed to pay the costs of prosecution and prisoner maintenance. No leading cattleman spent a day in prison for organizing or financing the invasion. The surviving invaders walked away from Fort D.A. Russell and from their legal entanglements. Some remained in Wyoming in reduced roles. Others moved on to other states or abroad, taking their money and their version of events with them. In Johnson County, the news that charges had been dropped confirmed what many settlers had already concluded, that the ordinary legal system would not punish men who combined wealth and political connections with hired guns. Even after the official cases ended, the war's human cost kept climbing. In the fall of 1892, range detectives shot and killed 2 alleged horse thieves east of the Bighorn River, killings that many in the region saw as direct continuations of the cattlemen's private justice campaign. Then on May 24, 1893, Nate Champion's brother Dudley rode into Johnson County looking for work and encountered former invader scout Mike Shaughnessy at a ranch several miles from town. Shaughnessy recognized the family name, grabbed a rifle, and shot Dudley dead without warning. A coroner's jury accepted Shaughnessy's claim of self-defense and cleared him. Before authorities could reconsider the decision, he left the state. Dudley Champion's death stood as the last killing directly tied to the Johnson County War. Politics shifted as well. Outrage over the invasion and the handling of the prosecutions helped fuel a change in Wyoming's leadership. In the state elections of 1892, voters turned to Democrats in greater numbers. handing that party the governorship and both houses of the legislature. In later national contests, including the presidential election of 1896, Johnson County and several other Wyoming counties gave strong majorities to William Jennings Bryan and his calls for challenging concentrated financial power. On the range itself, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, shaken by the public relations disaster of the invasion and by the steady shift of public opinion, opened its membership to smaller ranchers and abandoned the most aggressive forms of private enforcement that had characterized the previous decade. By late 1893, open gunfire between cattle barons and small stockmen in Johnson County had faded, replaced by lawsuits, political organizing, and quieter forms of economic competition. The physical scars of the war remained visible in places where cabins had burned and rifle pits had sunk into the earth. Families that had lost fathers, sons, and brothers lived with empty chairs at their tables. Men who had ridden in the posse, dug trenches at the TA Ranch, or watched the invaders march away under cavalry escort carried their memories into middle age. The conflict's official dates ran from the lynching of James Averill and Ella Watson in 1889 to the killing of Dudley Champion in 1893. For the people of Johnson County, the sense of what had been taken from them continued far beyond those 4 years, 1893 into the new century. In the summer after the last trial collapsed, riders crossing the benches above Clear Creek still saw cattle scattered across the grass and smoke curling from cookhouse chimneys. But they also passed places that did not fit the easy picture of an untouched range. Charred patches on low rises marked where line cabins had burned. Splintered logs at the TA Ranch still carried the white scars of bullets. A few miles away, the graveyard on the hill above Buffalo had gained new headstones carved with dates from the war years, and every time a funeral party climbed that slope, the older men at the back looked toward the south and remembered rifle shots over Crazy Woman Creek. On one small place along Clear Creek, a woman whose husband had gone to the KC Ranch and never returned kept her place going with the help of 2 sons and a neighbor who rode over whenever he could spare a day. Her kitchen table doubled as a desk where she sorted bills, counted the few dollars left after paying for seed and taxes, and made lists of tools they needed before the next haying season. Outside, her boys forked hay to a handful of cows that had survived the hard years and the fighting that followed. They had grown up faster than most children, learning early that the land they worked had nearly been taken from them by men who had never seen their house. In Buffalo, life settled into patterns that looked ordinary from across the street, but the war remained present in small ways. Sheriffs, county attorneys, and judges rode into town on court days knowing that the people watching them had seen what happened when law officers stood up to men with money and political sponsors. Merchants who had extended credit to homesteaders during the siege counted coins at the end of each month and remembered the days when armed men had camped 2 miles away at the TA Ranch. In the saloons, some of the same cowboys who had once drawn wages from big outfits now drank in the same room with men who had dug rifle pits. Conversation steered carefully around certain subjects, yet the names of Champion, Jones, and Tisdale still surfaced whenever tempers flared. Political change reached Buffalo in the form of new faces standing on makeshift platforms in front of the courthouse. Candidates spoke in plain language regarding what had happened when a private association tried to run a county like a company pasture. Ranchers who had ridden in the posse listened with arms folded while storekeepers and blacksmiths nodded along. When ballots were cast in town and at scattered schoolhouses out on the creeks, many long-standing office holders tied to the big outfits found that they no longer had enough neighbors willing to mark their names. New men took seats in Cheyenne who had ridden fence or worked small herds themselves and who understood that laws written for one class of rancher would not hold the state together. In Cheyenne, the leaders of the Wyoming stock, Growers' Association gathered in rooms that felt different than they had a few years earlier. The maps spread across their tables still showed the familiar rivers and range lines, but no one spoke openly of raising another armed expedition. Some of the men who had pressed hardest for the Johnson County campaign had left the state or retreated from public life. Those who remained had to answer questions from new legislators and from stockmen who ran only a few hundred head but now demanded a voice in meetings. Membership lists expanded and rules changed so that small ranchers could attend conventions and vote on shipping schedules and roundup regulations. The association still held influence, yet it no longer acted as a closed council giving orders to an entire region. On the ground in Johnson County, the shape of ranch work altered in steady, practical ways. Families who had once depended on open grass through winter began to treat hay and shelter as matters of survival rather than optional insurance. Men put in long days cutting poles in the Bighorn foothills, dragging them down to the valleys and setting posts in rows that marked off hay meadows and winter lots. Barbed wire stretched from post to post with a rasping sound that carried over the sound of creeks. Wells were dug deeper and windmills went up on knolls where steady air could turn their veins. Each fence corner and each stack of hay standing close to a barn represented a decision to rely less on distant companies and more on a family's own labor. New patterns of law followed those physical changes. Brand inspectors now worked more visibly under county and state authority, traveling between ranches with ledgers that recorded marks for large outfits and small spreads alike. When cattle changed hands, written bills of sale passed with them instead of only spoken agreements. Cases of theft still occurred, but when a man was accused of taking stock that did not belong to him, deputies led him to a courthouse rather than to a cottonwood tree. Juries drawn from townsmen and ranchers listened to evidence laid out in cramped rooms rather than hearing rumors repeated at saloon tables. Acquittals and convictions both carried more weight because they were reached under procedures that everyone could see. The old style of private range detective began to disappear. A few of the men who had ridden with association wages in their pockets drifted south or west when they realized that their skills now brought more risk than reward. Others stayed in Wyoming but took up quieter work as ordinary cowhands, freighters, or small ranchers. Stories circulated in bunkhouses regarding former gunmen who kept to themselves on paydays and avoided talk regarding the years when they had drawn extra pay for night rides and sudden hangings. Younger cowboys listened to those stories and understood that there had been a time when pulling a trigger for a stock outfit brought praise instead of a summons, and that the county did not allow that again. Remembering the war became part of everyday life. On Sundays, when the weather allowed, families sometimes drove out from Buffalo to the site of the KC Ranch. Parents pointed out the low mound where the cabin had stood and the scattered bits of metal still half buried in the soil. Children picked up rusted cartridges and bent nails and felt the weight of objects that had been in the ground since the morning champion died. A little farther south, visitors to the TA Ranch could still trace the shallow depressions where rifle pits had cut into the earth. In time, a museum in Buffalo collected Champion's surviving notebook pages, weapons from both sides, and personal items found on the field, arranging them in glass cases so that people who had not been born during the war could see the things their parents talked about. Writers carried the story beyond county lines. A former newspaper editor who had once defended the big outfit sat down at his desk in a modest office and began to put together a long account that named names, printed copies of telegrams, and described in detail how the invasion had been planned and carried out. When his pages reached print, cattle leaders tried to stop their spread by using courts and threats, but copies traveled anyway, tucked into trunks and saddlebags. In distant towns, readers who had never seen Wyoming learned that a group of ranch owners had hired gunmen, filled a special train, and marched into a county to hang neighbors under their own authority, only to be stopped by local settlers and federal troops. Novelists soon took up the same material and reshaped it. An Eastern visitor who had ridden through Johnson County years after the war sat in hotel parlors listening to old cowhands and merchants trade stories. He went home and wrote about a range torn between big outfits and independent men, about cowboys forced to choose between orders from owners and loyalties to friends, and about a final confrontation on open ground. He changed names, shifted events, and added imagined conversations. But the bones of his story rested on what had happened along the Powder River. Readers bought his book for its scenes of horsebreaking, card games, and gunfights, without always realizing that its hardest parts came from real places with real graves. As the century turned, the physical frontier in Johnson County narrowed. Wire fences drew lines where only survey stakes had stood before. Section corners were marked with stones and posts recognized by county records. Range riders still drifted long distances with their herds, yet they did so with a sharper sense of where one man's winter pasture ended and another's began. Telephones began to appear in some ranch houses and in stores in Buffalo, carrying voices along wires that also marked new connections. Disputes over water and grass were now often handled first through letters, meetings, and threats of lawsuits instead of through armed parties leaving town under cover of darkness. Elsewhere in the state and across the region, clashes over grazing continued, especially between cattle and sheep outfits, but what had happened in Johnson County affected them. When a group of cattlemen gathered in another county years later to plan a raid on a sheep camp, more than one man at the table reminded the others what had happened when stock interests in Wyoming had last picked up rifles in large numbers. Some raids still occurred and some herders died, yet the men who ordered and carried out those attacks found it harder to present themselves publicly as defenders of order. Courts that had once looked the other way now heard arguments from prosecutors who pointed straight back to Johnson County as proof that the state could not tolerate organized private war. Within the homes of those who had ridden in Angus's posse, the war's memory shaped how older people talked about law and power. Around winter stoves, fathers told sons how they had ridden out with their neighbors, dug into cold mud around the TA ranch, and watched cavalry lead prisoners away to safety instead of to the Johnson County jail. They spoke of the anger they had felt then and of the patience it had taken afterward to push for changes through elections and council meetings. Daughters heard their mothers describe nights spent alone with children while guns sounded in the distance, and how they had kept lamps burning in windows so that riders coming home late would see that someone waited for them. For the children who grew up listening to those stories, the Johnson County War marked a divide between two ways of living on the plains. On one side stood the years when a handful of powerful men believed that owning most of the cattle gave them the right to decide who could hold land, who could brand calves, and who could stand for local office. On the other side lay a rougher equality in which families who had almost nothing but their labor insisted that their names mattered as much on a ballot, on a deed, and in a courtroom as the names of men who spent their winters in Cheyenne parlors. That sense of the conflict as a turning point seeped into talk at branding fires and county fairs long after the last participant in the war was gone. By the early years of the new century, Johnson County had settled into a pattern that mixed large ranches and smaller spreads under a tighter web of law and custom than had existed 20 years earlier. The biggest outfits still shipped trainloads of cattle east. Smaller operators still worried every season regarding drought, sickness, and prices. Yet none of them assumed that an argument over range use could be settled by quietly hiring riders from another state and sending them out with ropes and rifles. The memory of mass graves avoided and of a community that had dug in on its own soil stood in the way of that idea. The war left scars that visitors could see in museum cases and on old timbers, but it also left changes in habits that were less obvious yet just as real. Men who met in courthouse hallways to argue over water rights now did so knowing that someone would reach for a statute book instead of a six-shooter. Stock associations that drafted policies for roundups and shipping dates did so with smaller ranchers sitting in the same rooms. When telegraph wires carried news of disputes on other ranges, people in Johnson County read those stories with a particular kind of attention born from lived experience. For the old settlers who watched these later years unfold, the Johnson County War was not a legend but a set of days they could count on their fingers. The morning champion woke to gunfire at the KC, the ride into Buffalo to raise the county, the trench digging at the TA Ranch, the moment the cavalry flag appeared on the ridge, the months of waiting for trials that never came. They saw the war's outcome in every new fence line, every election where a small rancher took office, and every court case where a brand dispute ended with a written judgment instead of a body hanging from a cottonwood tree. In that way, the Powder River country carried the war forward not as a distant episode, but as a constant reminder that people living on the fringe of the Old West had forced a change in how power was used, and that once they had done so, even the largest cattle interests had to live with the limits set by that stand.